Somewhere along the great bend of the Yellow River, the night is very still. The air smells of river mud and cool grass. There is no hurry here. There never was. Just the slow turning of the world, the soft pull of the current, and the quiet understanding that everything, the water, the land, the sky above, was always somehow connected. Let that feeling settle into you now. You are already drifting towards something old and gentle. The Huanghe, the Yellow River, gave the land its name and its color. Each spring, when the snowmelt came down from the highlands, the river would rise and spread across the fields in slow, warm sheets of ochre water. The mud it left behind was extraordinarily rich. Farmers would press their bare feet into it and feel the warmth held there, the warmth of 1,000 miles of mountain and plain deposited gently at their feet. Millet and wheat were planted in that wet, giving earth. The seeds disappeared into the mud almost without effort, as if the soil were simply accepting them, drawing them down into a soft and generous dark. In the weeks that followed, the scent of damp earth and slowly ripening grain would drift across the river plains and settle over the villages like a low, pleasant haze. It was the smell of the year beginning again. In the city of Anyang, the great capital of the Shang dynasty, life moved at the pace of ritual and season. The city was not loud in the way we might imagine. It was ordered, layered, and deeply quiet beneath its surface activity. Workshops hummed with careful labor. Courtyards collected the morning light. And at the edges of the city where the fields began, the boundary between the human world and the natural one was almost invisible. In the bronze casting workshops of Anyang, craftsmen worked in patient, unhurried shifts. They had learned their art from their fathers, and their fathers before them. The molds were made of clay, each one a careful negative impression of the vessel to come. Bronze was poured in slowly, glowing with orange heat, filling the spaces of the mold the way water fills a cupped hand. Then came the long waiting, as the metal cooled on earthen floors. The vessels that emerged from those molds were extraordinary things. Ding tripods, broad and stable, meant to hold offerings of food. Wine vessels with their curved necks. Gu beakers, tall and slender, rising to a slight flare at the rim. Each surface was covered in patterns, spirals within spirals, eyes of animals peering out from abstract forms, a whole cosmology pressed into a few inches of bronze. They cooled slowly, ticking as they settled. These vessels were not made for daily use. They were made for the rituals that held the world together. Offerings to ancestors, to spirits, to the unseen presences that the Shang people believed moved alongside the living. Each vessel was a kind of address, a formal and respectful reaching towards something beyond the visible. Setting one down before an altar was not a solemn act so much as a familiar one, like leaving a light on for someone expected home. And then there was jade. The Shang people believed jade was the flesh of heaven itself, a material that belonged to a register of existence slightly above the ordinary. It came in colors like celadon and pale green, sometimes almost white, sometimes the deep olive of still river water. To hold a piece was to feel something unexpectedly alive in it, a coolness, a smoothness that seemed too perfect for something simply pulled from the earth. Jewelers shaped jade with quartz sand and bamboo drills, an almost impossibly slow process in which the stone seemed to offer itself only in its own time. There was no rushing it. A single carved dragon amulet might take weeks. The craftsman would work by feel as much as by sight, sensing the grain of the stone beneath the tool, listening, or so it seemed, to the quiet sound the bamboo made as it turned, a whisper of sand on mineral, patient and continuous. When someone died, jade was laid over them. Amulets shaped like dragons and fish, sometimes discs called bai, were placed on the body to guide the spirit safely through the dark passage between one world and the next. The jade would outlast everything else, the silk, the wood, the bronze eventually, and lie in the earth for 3,000 years, still cool, still smooth, still carrying within it some quality that felt, even to modern hands, like something more than stone. The royal tombs at Anyang were large, quiet chambers dug deep into the earth. By the time they were sealed, they held an entire world in miniature. Bronze vessels, jade sculptures, silk cushions now long dissolved into impression and trace. Archaeologists working in those chambers centuries later would find the ghost of fabric in the soil, fine parallel lines where richly colored robes had once lain, the weave still faintly visible in the pressed earth, like a memory the ground had kept. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining those chambers now, sealed for so long in perfect silence. The objects inside arranged with care and intention, each one placed by hands that believed in what they were doing, believed that the person going into the dark would need these things, would find them waiting, would feel the love that had placed them there. It is, when you let it settle, a very gentle idea that those we love do not go empty-handed. At night, in the courts of Anyang, the priests prepared for the oracle bone rituals. These ceremonies were held after dark, when the boundary between the everyday world and the world of the ancestors felt a little thinner, a little more permeable. Bronze oil lamps cast low pools of amber light across the courtyard stones. The air was cool. Someone might have been burning dried herbs nearby, a faint, dry sweetness drifting through the dark. The oracle bones were turtle shells and the flat shoulder blades of oxen. Before the ritual, they were cleaned and smoothed and prepared with small hollows drilled into their inner surfaces, places designed to guide the cracking. The priest would hold the bone over the flame and wait. There was patience in this, no rushing. The fire did its work slowly, and the priest simply attended, watching for the moment when the heat would find its way through the bone and speak. The crack, when it came, was soft, a small, delicate sound, like a twig breaking in a forest at some distance. The priest would lean close and study the pattern by lamplight. Each line in the shell was a sentence from the ancestors. Will the harvest be abundant this year? Will the army be victorious? Is the ruler's illness temporary? The questions were practical and careful, and the answers read in the branching lines were accepted with the same quiet practicality. What is remarkable is that some of those questions and their answers were then inscribed on the bones themselves, preserved in the earliest known Chinese writing. The priest would take a bronze stylus and carve small pictographic characters into the surface. The sun, the moon, the mountain, the woman. The characters were drawn from the world immediately around them. Simple images made precise, made permanent, pressed into bone to outlast the fire and the night and every dynasty that followed. Those early pictograms are the ancestors of the characters still written today. The same mark that meant sun in the Shang period became, through slow and organic transformation, the character that Chinese speakers write for sun right now, thousands of years later. To trace that line is to feel how long and continuous the thread of human meaning really is. A scratch in bone, a breath of lamp smoke, and something that would outlast everything. The rulers of the Shang dynasty claimed the mandate of heaven, Tianming. It was not a loud claim. It was more like a given, a quiet structural fact at the center of Shang society. The ruler was the bridge between the earth and the sky, between the ancestors below and the celestial powers above. Each morning, as the light came up in the east, courtiers would turn and bow toward the rising sun, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the calm regularity of breath. Heaven, in the Shang conception, was not a distant abstraction. It was a presence felt in the turning of the seasons, in the regularity of the river's floods, in the predictable arc of the sun, and the reliable return of certain stars. The ruler's role was simply to remain in right relationship with all of that, to perform the rituals, to honor the ancestors, to keep the human world in gentle alignment with the larger rhythms surrounding it. It was, at its heart, a philosophy of listening. The Shang astronomers were careful and methodical observers. They recorded solar eclipses on oracle bones, noting the date, the duration, the quality of the darkening sky. They divided the night sky into 28 lunar mansions, each one a section of the heavens associated with a particular animal, a particular season, a particular quality of time. The horn, the neck, the root, the heart. Each name was a small poem, a compression of observation into language. On clear evenings in the plains of what is now Henan province, the Milky Way would have been extraordinarily visible, a wide, luminous band crossing from one horizon to the other, so dense with stars that it cast a faint and gentle light on the ground below. A Shang astronomer standing in the courtyard of the palace, neck tilted back, would have been able to trace the 28 mansions across the dome of sky as easily as a familiar road. The stars were a map. The map was home. In the early spring, when the first warmth returned to the earth, the Shang court would prepare for the great agricultural festival. The lunar calendar marked it precisely, the moment when the season turned, when the ground was ready to receive seed again. The king himself was expected to take up a ceremonial plow and turn the first furrow in the sacred field. Not because he knew how to farm particularly, but because the act itself was a kind of prayer, the ruler meeting the earth. After the ritual plowing, there was music. Bronze bells called zhong were struck with padded mallets, each one a clean, round tone that hung in the cool air for a long moment before it faded. Bone flutes, called shun, produced a softer, more intimate sound, something between breath and melody. Together they created a kind of music that was not meant to excite or rouse, but to settle, to align the gathered people with the season, with the earth, with each other. Somewhere in those same spring gatherings, silk was already being made. The legend says that Empress Lezu discovered the first silk thread when a cocoon fell into her warm tea and began to unwind in a single continuous filament. Whether the story is literally true is not important. What matters is the image it gives. The thread coming loose in warm water, patient and unbroken, a material that seemed almost to offer itself freely when treated with gentleness. Women gathered the cocoons from mulberry trees and brought them back to be softened in warm water. The unwinding was done by hand, a slow, meditative process in which the thread emerged from the cocoon in an almost continuous strand, impossibly fine, catching the light in small shifts of white and silver. One cocoon might yield nearly a mile of thread. The women worked quietly, often in groups, the sound of water and the occasional soft creak of a reel filling the room. The resulting fabric was unlike anything else in the ancient world, cool in summer, warm in winter, with a drape and luminosity that made it seem almost to move of its own accord in low light. To wear silk in the Shang period was to carry a piece of something that required enormous patience to produce. Every length of cloth represented weeks of careful, unhurried labor. Perhaps that is why it felt different. Perhaps the cloth remembered the hands that made it. The days in Anyang passed in layered rhythms. The rhythm of the river, the rhythm of the rituals, the rhythm of workshops and fields, and the turning lunar calendar. It was a world that understood time differently than we do. Not as something to be managed or conserved, but as something to be moved with, like water, like breath. The Shang people oriented themselves not by the clock, but by the quality of the light, the state of the fields, the position of the stars, and somewhere in that world, in a workshop smelling of bronze and clay, or beside the river at the slow amber hour before sunset, or in a courtyard where the bronze bells had just been struck and their tones were still dissolving into the cool air, ordinary people were living ordinary lives, eating millet, telling each other small things, watching their children discover the same world they themselves had discovered, and finding it just as full and just as sufficient. Let that thought carry you now into the quiet. The Yellow River moves through its plains tonight, just as it always has, not rushing, not dramatic, just continuous. Somewhere in its slow passage, it carries particles of the same ochre earth that Shang farmers pressed their seeds into more than 3,000 years ago. The same silt, the same weight of mountain and distance, the same patient delivery of something fertile to the waiting fields below. The river does not hurry. Neither do you. Just rest now. The current will carry you the rest of the way, and so the river carries us forward, gently, into a quieter age. The Zhou dynasty settled into the land the way morning light settles into a valley, gradually, without announcement. Their capital, Hao, rose near what is now the city of Xi'an, cradled between low hills and the slow bend of the Wei River. It was not a city of noise. It was a city of ceremony, of careful movement, of rituals practiced so often they became as natural as breathing. Within the Zhou court, every gesture carried meaning. How you bowed depended on who stood before you. How you poured wine into a cup depended on whether the guest was a minister or a king. These were not tedious rules. They were a kind of poetry written in motion. The Chinese word for this was li, often translated simply as ritual, but it meant something closer to the rightness of things, the proper way, the fitting form, a slow, courteous dance that everyone knew by heart. Imagine standing in that courtyard in the early morning. The air still carries the cool of the night. A bell somewhere inside the palace rings once, softly. Ministers move in slow procession through carved wooden gates. Their robes, deep red, forest green, the color of old jade, brush against the swept earth floor. No one rushes. No one raises a voice. The silence between each gesture is as important as the gesture itself. Like the space between musical notes, it gives the whole thing its shape. But not all Zhou life was contained within palace walls. By the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, a man named Kong Chu was walking the dusty roads between kingdoms. We know him today as Confucius. He was not young when he began these travels, perhaps already in his mid-40s. And the roads between the small warring states of ancient China were not comfortable roads. They were long and dry and sometimes dangerous. Still, he walked them, season after season, year after year. He traveled with a small group of students, perhaps a dozen or so, depending on the year. They carried their belongings in simple bundles. Some were young, some had followed him for a decade. Rulers occasionally received Confucius and listened to what he had to say about virtue and good governance. They nodded, they thanked him, and then, more often than not, they did not change a thing. It might have discouraged another man. Confucius seems to have accepted it with a patience that resembled wisdom. In the evenings, after long days of walking or waiting in unfamiliar courts, the group would find somewhere to rest, a small fire, perhaps a borrowed courtyard or a clearing near the road. The students would sit together in the warmth, talking quietly about what the master had said that day. Sometimes Confucius would say something almost in passing, a short remark, a gentle observation, and those words would stay with a student for the rest of his life. That is how great teaching works. Quietly, without insisting on itself. None of what Confucius said was written down while he lived. His words existed only in the memories of those who heard them. After his death, his students gathered, carefully, tenderly, and tried to recall what the master had said. They wrote it down sentence by sentence in short passages, the way you might preserve something fragile. The result was the Lunyu, known in the West as the Analects, a slim, quiet collection, more like notes from a beloved conversation than a formal philosophy. The sentences in the Analects are short, meditative. They do not argue or demand, they simply offer. To learn and then practice what you have learned Is that not a pleasure? Reading them even now in translation, there is something restful in their quietness. They were written by people who loved their teacher and wanted to preserve not just his ideas, but the feeling of sitting near him, of hearing his voice, of being in the presence of someone who had thought carefully about how to live. Somewhere around the same era, though the exact time is uncertain, and perhaps that is fitting, another text came into being, the Tao Te Ching. 81 short chapters, a small book that fits easily in the palm of your hand. It is attributed to a man called Laozi, which means something close to old master, and whether he was a single historical person or a gradual gathering of wisdom across many voices is something scholars have never fully settled. The uncertainty somehow suits the text perfectly. The legend most often told says Laozi was an archivist, a keeper of records, who grew old in the Zhou capital and finally decided to leave. He rode out on a water buffalo toward the western frontier, toward the mountains and the unknown. At the border, the gatekeeper asked him to leave something behind before he disappeared into the wilderness. And so he sat and he wrote the Tao Te Ching. Then he rode on and was not seen again. It is a story that feels like a dream, quiet and unhurried and complete. The Tao Te Ching begins with something almost impossible to hold. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. It is not a contradiction so much as an invitation to stop grasping, to stop defining, to let understanding arrive the way sleep arrives. Not when you chase it, but when you stop resisting and simply allow. The Tao, the way, is described as water. It does not force. It finds the lowest places. It wears away stone not through violence, but through patient, constant presence. There was another philosopher traveling in those same centuries, visiting those same courts, making those same long journeys. Mencius, or Mengzi as he is known in Chinese, had studied the tradition of Confucius and extended it with a particular warmth. He believed at his core that human beings are naturally good, not perfect, not always wise, but fundamentally, at the beginning of things, inclined toward goodness, the way a spring is inclined to rise. Something may press it down, something may block it, but the impulse upward is always there. Mencius would sit with rulers, kings and lords who held power over thousands of lives, and speak to them plainly. He once said, "The people are the most important element in a state. Then come the spirits and the gods of the land. The ruler is last." It was a remarkable thing to say to a man who commanded armies. Yet Mencius said it with the calm certainty of someone who has thought a thing through so thoroughly that no amount of royal displeasure can shake it loose. That kind of quietness is its own kind of courage. This was the era known as the 100 Schools of Thought, a name that conjures somehow the image of 100 small lamps lit across a very large, dark plain. In the Eastern Zhou period, as kingdoms rose and fell and borders shifted like sand, something remarkable happened. Ideas multiplied. Taoists and Confucians, Mohists and legalists debated and wrote and traveled. Students walked hundreds of li, sometimes weeks of walking, to study under a particular master. The hunger for understanding was enormous. These academies were not grand institutions. They were often simply a courtyard, a covered walkway, a teacher who arrived each morning and spoke with whoever had come to listen. The debates were real debates about the nature of the state, about whether human nature is good or neutral, about whether action or stillness is more powerful. Young men argued passionately, old masters responded with patience, and somewhere in all that conversation, something lasting was being built, even if no one at the time could quite see what it was. Confucius believed, with a particular depth of feeling, that music was not merely pleasant, it was moral. It was shaping, the right music, played correctly, on the right instruments, in the right modes, could bring a person into alignment with something larger than themselves. A ruler surrounded by good music would be a good ruler. A court that practiced classical music was a court that understood order and harmony. And so, before sunrise each morning, the court musicians would begin their practice in the early dark. The instrument most closely associated with this tradition was the qin, a long, slender zither whose strings are silk, whose body is lacquered paulownia wood, whose sound is something between a plucked note and a sigh. Playing it well required years of practice. The sound it makes is intimate, not meant for large halls, but for quiet rooms, for one listener, for late evenings when conversation has given way to something that needs no words. Even now, centuries later, to hear a guqin played well is to feel somehow less hurried, less separate from things. But the Zhou era produced something else entirely when it comes to music, something vast and extraordinary. In 1978, archaeologists excavating the tomb of a nobleman known as Marquis Yi of Zheng, who died around 433 BCE, discovered a set of bronze bells. Not a few bells, 65 of them, arranged on a great L-shaped frame of lacquered wood, tier upon tier, from small to enormous. The largest bells are the size of a man, the smallest could rest in both cupped hands. Together, they weighed more than 2,500 kilograms. Each bell produces two distinct tones, depending on where it is struck. Together, the 65 bells can produce a range of notes across 5 octaves. They had lain in the earth, sealed in darkness and silence, for 2,400 years. And when archaeologists finally struck them, carefully, with replicas of the original wooden mallets, the bells rang. They were still playable. The sound that had been stored inside that bronze for 24 centuries came out again into the world, unchanged. There is something deeply peaceful in that thought. While philosophers debated the nature of the Tao, and musicians pressed their fingers to silk strings before the sun had risen, most people in the Zhou world lived lives that were quieter in a different way. The quietness of the field, of the granary, of the cooking fire. In the north, where the soil was dry and pale, they grew millet, hardy grain, the color of pale gold, that could survive the long, cold winters between the Yellow River and the mountains beyond. In the south, in the wet lowlands, they grew rice. By the 9th month of the Chinese calendar, autumn deepening toward the cold, the harvest came in. It was a time of relief and celebration mixed together, the way good things often are. Families worked together in the fields from first light, cutting and gathering. In the evenings there were simple meals, millet porridge, perhaps some roasted soybeans, preserved vegetables from earthenware jars. Music was played. Not the formal music of the court, but simpler songs, the kind that had been sung in those fields for generations before anyone thought to write them down. Inside the farmhouses, as the evenings grew longer and colder, women sat near the cooking fire and wove. New cotton garments for winter, heavy fabric in plain colors, stitched carefully by lamplight. The sound of a loom in a small room is a rhythmic sound, steady and unhurried, like a slow heartbeat. The warp and weft threading together in the warm air. Outside, the first frost might be settling on the fields. Inside, the fire crackled softly and the fabric grew, row by patient row. And woven through all of it, the court ceremonies, the philosophical journeys, the harvest meals, the loom's soft rhythm, was the idea that the Taoist thinkers called Wu Wei, non-action, or more precisely, the action that is in harmony with the natural way of things. A craftsman who does not force his chisel but lets it follow the grain of the wood finds that the wood cooperates. The cut is clean. Nothing is wasted. The effort is in the end effortless. It is a strange thing to describe, but you may already understand it. Wu Wei is not laziness. It is not indifference. It is the recognition that some things, when pursued too hard, escape. Sleep is like that. You cannot force it. You can only create the conditions, the warmth, the quiet, the softening of attention, and allow it to arrive in its own time. The Taoist philosophers understood this in the abstract as a principle of governance and nature. But it is also simply true in the most ordinary and immediate way right now, in this room, in this moment. The Zhou world was not simple, and it was not always peaceful. The later part of the dynasty, the Warring States period, was exactly what its name suggests. Kingdoms fought, armies marched. But even in those troubled centuries, the philosophers kept writing, kept walking those long roads, kept sitting together by small fires in the evenings talking about what it means to live rightly. Perhaps because of the difficulty, not despite it. Perhaps when the world outside grows loud and uncertain, the quiet question of how to live becomes the most important question of all. And so the Zhou centuries pass the way centuries always pass. Slowly and all at once. In the capital, a minister pours wine with careful hands, observing the form that has been observed 10,000 times before him. On a road somewhere between kingdoms, a small group of travelers stops for the night, and someone asks a question that no one can quite answer. And they sit with the unanswered question in the firelight, and that is enough. In a southern field, a woman finishes a long row of cloth and listens to the rain beginning on the roof. The bronze bells in their nobleman's tomb do not know that centuries will pass before anyone strikes them again. They simply hold their tones, patient and complete, sealed in their careful arrangement, waiting in the dark earth. And the dark earth holds them gently, the way good rest holds a tired mind. Not pressing, not demanding, simply present, simply quiet. The sound is there. It has always been there. Sometimes it only needs to be allowed, the way you allow your breathing to slow now and your thoughts to soften at the edges. Let the Zhou world settle around you like the last of the evening. The court ceremonies are finishing, the last bow made, the last cup of wine set carefully aside on its lacquered tray. The philosophers are falling silent by their fires, the unfinished conversations hanging pleasantly in the cooling air. The looms have stopped their rhythm. The millet fields lie still under a wide autumn sky. The water, as always, finds the lowest place and rests there, not rushing, not resisting, simply being where it is, doing what water has always done in the quiet dark. And now, gently, let us move forward through time. Not with a great leap or a sudden change, but the way a river bends, slowly, almost without your noticing. The seasons have turned, the small kingdoms have grown older, and out of all that quiet accumulation of harvests and conversations and careful brushwork, something new is beginning to take shape. A single voice, rising not loudly, but with a kind of steady, inevitable weight. The way a stone settles into riverbed mud, unhurried, final, and strangely peaceful. In a place called Xi'an, though it was not yet called that, beneath the long amber skies of the Wei River plain, craftsmen arrived from every corner of China. They came with their tools in cloth bundles, small wooden scrapers, bone-handled knives, coils of cord. They were assigned to long earthen workshops, low buildings with roof tiles the color of old moss. Inside, oil lamps burned steadily through the night, filling the air with a faint, warm smell, the way a candle smells when it has been burning for a long time. Quietly, honestly. These craftsmen were building something the world had never seen and has never quite seen again. More than 8,000 figures, soldiers, generals, archers, cavalrymen, each one shaped by hand from the reddish-brown earth. And here is the thing that is easy to forget, resting quietly with your eyes closed. Every single face was different, not stamped from a mold, not repeated, each one subtly, carefully individual. A slightly wider jaw here, a softer brow there. Someone's particular expression of calm attention, pressed forever into clay. The hands were modeled separately too. The craftsmen would have worked in the lamplight, pressing their own thumbs gently into the clay to open the curve of a palm. When the figures were finished, they were painted, vivid lacquers of red and green and black and white, colors bright as a market stall, colors that have since faded almost entirely in the earth and the centuries. But for a little while, standing in the lamplight of those workshops, they must have seemed startlingly alive, ranks upon ranks of them, still and quiet, glowing softly in the warm dark. At the end of each long day, the craftsmen returned to their sleeping barracks, long rooms with bamboo mats laid side by side on raised earthen platforms. They had eaten simply, bowls of millet gruel, dried vegetables, perhaps a piece of salted fish. They had drunk warm water. They lay down without ceremony, pulling rough cloth over themselves, and the lamps went out one by one, and the workshops fell quiet. And outside the stars were very bright over the Wei River plain, and the clay figures stood in the dark, waiting patiently to be finished. Beyond those workshops, the new empire was being quietly organized in ways that touched every corner of daily life. There was, for instance, the matter of roads. The old paths across northern China had been worn deep over generations, grooves pressed into the earth by cartwheels, some of them so worn that a wheel could not easily leave the rut it had found. And now came a decree, simple and practical as a good night's sleep. All carts in all of China would have the same axle width, the same track, the same groove from the capital to the sea. It is a small thing, in one sense, an axle width, a number agreed upon, but close your eyes and imagine it. A merchant loading his cart in the Shandong plains, setting his wheels into the ruts, and the cart rolling forward with a kind of ease that had not existed the day before. The roads across northern China were long and straight and pale as old bone in the autumn light. The sound of a cart moving along one of those roads was a gentle, rhythmic sound, a soft creak and turn, the hooves of oxen patient and slow, a traveler perhaps nodding into half-sleep. The roads were part of something larger, a network called Qidao, imperial highways, broad and rammed firm with earth and timber, stretching out from the capital like the branches of a very large, very deliberate tree. Along these roads at regular intervals stood post stations. A rider would arrive, his horse breathing hard, foam at the bit. He handed over his bamboo dispatch case, sealed, tied with cord, stamped with clay. A fresh horse was already waiting. He mounted and rode on, and the message continued forward into the empire, passed from hand to hand like a whisper that needed to arrive. At night, the fire towers along the wall sent their signals burning upward into the dark sky. Not urgently, or at least, let us imagine them not urgently tonight. Just the steady, patient light of a flame on a high stone platform, visible from many in every direction. The kind of light you might see from a distance as you approached along the road, tired from the day's journey, and feel a small but real comfort knowing it was there. Someone was awake, somewhere ahead, tending a fire in the dark, the signal burning steadily, orange and gold against the black mountain air. Not far from those roads on the long ridges and mountain passes of the north, another great work was underway. Slower, quieter, rhythmic, in a way that had a strange restfulness to it, if you were not among those doing it. The wall, or rather the beginnings of what the wall would become. Workers, farmers conscripted from their villages, soldiers, prisoners, stood in long lines along the ridgeline. Each held a wooden tamper, a long handle with a flat-weighted end, and they tamped. Layer after layer of rammed earth, hangtu, pressed down, compacted, made solid, thud, thud, thud. Let the sound of it carry you somewhere soft and far away, that rhythm, repeated thousands of times. Thud, thud, a pause, thud again. The mountain air cool and thin, the smell of damp earth freshly turned, that clean, deep smell that is one of the oldest smells a human being can know. The workers would have moved mechanically by the afternoon, their arms following the rhythm long after their minds had gone somewhere quieter. The mountains around them were silent except for wind and the regular sound of their work, and far off, the cry of a mountain bird passing overhead. The wall was not one unbroken thing. Not yet. It was a series of older ramparts, some built by kingdoms that no longer existed, linked now and extended, filled in, continued, like a sentence that had been interrupted many times and was now finally being finished. And what those workers were doing, layer by patient layer, was adding their breath and their strength to something that would outlast them by more than 2,000 years. They may not have known that. They probably just knew the tamper, and the next layer of earth, and the sound of it settling, and the moment when the work bell rang and they could stop. Back in the cities and market towns, there were quieter changes, changes you might not even have noticed at first. A new set of weights arrived at your market stall one morning. Copper, small, heavy in the hand, stamped with a character you had not seen before. A standard measure, the same as the one at the stall 3 towns away, the same as the one in a province you would never visit. The kun, the chi, the bu, the li. Numbers that meant the same thing everywhere, the way the moon means the same thing to everyone who looks at it. A small, profound, utterly practical gift. A merchant in Shandong, weighing out dried beans in the early morning, now used the same scale as a baker in Sichuan weighing rice flour. They would never meet. They would never know each other's name. But they shared between them this quiet agreement about the weight of things. And there is something in that, something almost tender, if you let yourself feel it lying there in the dark. The idea that 2 strangers, very far apart, are measuring the world with the same hands, the same increments, the same small, precise, shared understanding of what a portion means. And there was the writing. Before this time, each kingdom had its own way of writing the same word. The character for bird might be written with a curving sweep in one city and with a compact angular form in another. Officials in neighboring states could not always read each other's documents. And so the new empire introduced a single script, the small seal form, Shaozhuang, and gradually, carefully, brushed it onto bamboo strips throughout the land. Officials sat in their offices with their brushes and their rolls of stripped bamboo, learning the new characters. The brush moved slowly, precisely, with the quiet focus of someone doing something important in a small way. Bamboo strips were the paper of their world. Thin, pale, slightly curved reeds, each one trimmed and dried and smoothed before writing. An official would lay several side by side, write his characters down the length of each one, then bind them together with a cord threaded through small holes at top and bottom. The finished roll could be tucked under an arm, tied shut, sealed with a clay stamp at the knot. Messages and records and lists traveled this way across the empire. The bamboo was light, reliable, faintly fragrant. It made a soft sound when you until whisper. One of those officials. We know him from the bamboo texts discovered in a tomb at Shuhudi, kept lists with great care. Grain deliveries, labor days owed, counts of wall stones brought to a site, tallies of workers present and absent. He worked with a pointed brush, dipping it precisely, writing with unhurried economy, numbers and names and small practical truths. In the evening, when the light from his lamp had grown warm and low, he rolled his bamboo strips and bound them and sealed them with his personal clay seal, pressed from a small carved stone he carried always, and set them on his shelf. Then he ate, a bowl of soup thin and clear, with a few wilted greens floating at the surface. Millet, the grain of the north, cooked soft and simple. Perhaps a dried plum, sour and small, that he ate slowly, pressing the flesh of it gently between his back teeth, finding the last of its sweetness before setting the stone aside. He drank water from a clay cup. He may have sat for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, the day's work released, the lists and numbers fading. Then he lay down on his bamboo mat and pulled his cloth over himself and was asleep. Far to the west of all this careful, daily written order, there was another project, one that was harder to complete with measurements and edicts and standardized scripts. The emperor wanted to live forever. He had unified a vast empire, worn down the kingdoms, with that ordered the weights and the roads and the characters. But the one thing he could not decree into order was time. And so he turned, as people often do when faced with the one problem that has no administrative solution, toward wonder, toward the sea, toward the possibility that somewhere just over the horizon things were different. The islands of the immortals, Penglai, Fangzhang, Yingzhou, were said to float somewhere out in the eastern sea, unreachable by ordinary ships, visible only from a distance before dissolving back into the mist. Taoist masters came to the emperor's court and offered him their recipes: gold dissolved in mercury, mushrooms the color of pale jade, elixirs that would preserve the body past all natural limit. The ships were loaded and sent out at dawn, their sails filling with the morning wind, the harbor slowly shrinking behind them. They did not return. The sea kept its answer, as it always does. Meanwhile, at the palace gardens of Apeng, the morning arrived in a particular way. The gardens were vast, planted with more than 100 species of tree, pines and magnolias and willows, rare specimens brought from distant conquered lands. The ponds were filled with lotuses that had opened in the early light, their pink cups holding the night's coolness. The paths between them were laid with pressed pebbles, smooth and pale, and the sound of walking on them was a soft, irregular murmur, the voice of small stones shifting gently under unhurried feet. The dew gathered on the lotus leaves like drops of mercury, trembling when the morning wind passed. Those lotus leaves held the water perfectly, a large round leaf, slightly concave, catching the night dew in a gathered silver pool at its center. If you bent close, you could see your own reflection in it, distorted, round, strangely peaceful. And then the wind would pass, and the drop would tremble and find a new shape, and you would be different too, briefly, before the water settled again. The gardens were never quite completed. The palace itself was never quite finished. There was always more to build, more to plant, more to order into beauty. But the lotus did not wait for completion. It simply opened, each morning in the water it had. In 210 BCE, the emperor died while traveling, far from the palace, far from the gardens, far from the armies of clay standing in the dark. He had sought immortality and found instead what everyone finds: the ordinary, inevitable end of one particular life. The dynasty that had built so much, so fast, with such enormous pressure, it lasted only 15 more years before it fractured. Not because the idea had failed, but perhaps because it had been pressed too hard, too quickly, the way clay pressed too fast will crack before it dries. The Qin dynasty fell, and yet the roads remained, the script remained, the weights and measures, the shared language of numbers and characters, the grooves worn into the earth by wheels set to the same width from Shandong to Sichuan. All of this remained. The infrastructure outlasted the empire that built it. The quiet, practical gifts settled into the life of China the way sediment settles into a riverbed, layer by layer, without ceremony, until the land itself has changed shape and no one remembers what the bottom looked like before. The voice that had spoken too loudly left behind, in its silence, a very long echo. China would never again lose that shared language. The characters that officials had pressed onto bamboo in the lamplight of small offices, those characters would travel forward through every dynasty, every upheaval, every silence, and every flowering of civilization still to come. Written by brush, carved in stone, printed eventually on paper, carried in dispatch cases and scholars' sleeves, and the hands of ordinary people writing ordinary things. The word for bird would mean bird everywhere. The word for rest would mean rest. The word for water would carry its sound forward through all the centuries, soft and continuous as the thing it named. And so we leave the craftsmen of Xi'an resting on their bamboo mats after the long day's work. The clay figures stand in the dark beside the workshop, row after silent row, each face uniquely itself, each pair of hands shaped separately by a living hand now long at rest. The oil lamps have burned low. The fire towers along the wall send up their quiet orange light against the black northern sky. The post horses stand in the station yard, heads down, breathing slowly. The lotus in the palace pond holds its dew, perfectly still, waiting gently for the morning it will not remember having waited for. Let all of that settle now, the way the rammed earth settled under the tampers on the mountain ridge, layer by quiet layer, each one a little firmer than the last, until what was loose has become solid, and what was uncertain has become ground. The roads lie pale under the stars. The bamboo scrolls rest sealed on their shelves. The merchant's copper weights sit still on their wooden counter in the dark market, waiting for tomorrow's first light and first customer, patient as anything that knows it will be needed again. Rest now. The empire is sleeping. The craftsmen are sleeping. The clay soldiers in their long dark chamber are very, very still. And now gently we move forward in time. The dynasty has turned, like a page drying in the sun. A new era has settled over the land. The Han, patient and vast, stretching from the eastern sea to the edge of the known world. The name of the capital is Chang'an, which means perpetual peace. And on quiet mornings, walking its broad boulevards while the dew still clings to the stone, you might almost believe that name. Almost feel it in your chest, like something true. Chang'an was enormous, perhaps 500,000 souls living within its great rectangular walls. Imagine that. 500,000 people, their breath rising in winter, their laughter passing through open windows in summer. The city was laid out with intention and care, boulevards running north to south, east to west, crossing each other in long, clean lines. It was a city that believed in order, that found comfort in the straight line, the measured distance, the known direction. Each morning, the markets opened and the goods carts came, wheels turning slowly on the stone, piled with grain and cloth and pottery. Merchants calling out in low voices, not yet fully awake. The city breathed in and filled itself. And each evening, when the sun tilted low and golden over the western wall, a drum was struck, a single deep sound rolling through the streets, and the city gates were closed. The world outside stayed outside. The world inside settled into itself. It was in this city, in the year 138 before the Common Era, that an emperor sent a man westward into the unknown. His name was Zhang Qian, and his instructions were simple and impossible. Travel into lands no Chinese envoy had visited. Find allies among peoples no one could name. He left with 100 men. He would not return for more than 10 years, and what he brought back would change everything. Not with a sword, but with knowledge, quietly carried in the mind. Zhang Qian was captured. The Xiongnu held him for years among their felt tents and open plains, the wind moving through the grass in long, slow waves. He did not give up his mission. He watched and waited and learned. When he finally escaped and pressed westward, he reached the lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, places with names that felt like music from another tongue. He saw horses unlike any in China. He tasted grapes and pomegranates for the first time. He carried all of it home inside him. When Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an, thin and older and full of wonders, his report opened something in the empire's imagination that could not be closed again. There were other worlds. There were roads that could reach them, and slowly, carefully, like a thread drawn from a cocoon, the Silk Road began. Not a single road, but many, oasis to oasis, mountain pass to valley, desert crossing to river crossing, a long, slow breathing of goods and ideas between east and west. Through the gateway town of Dunhuang, the caravans moved westward, camels in long, swaying lines, their footsteps soft on the desert sand. Strapped to their backs were bales of silk, pressed and folded and wrapped, colors that seemed to glow even in the dry desert light. Red, the color of embers; gold, the color of late afternoon; turquoise, like a still and distant sea. The silk moved through the world like a slow dream, passed from hand to hand across mountains and deserts. And what came back in return was just as beautiful. Saffron, whose scent was warm and a little sharp, like sunlight trapped in a flower. Lapis lazuli, blue as deep water, ground into pigment for paintings. Glass vessels, nearly weightless, catching the light in colors that Han craftsmen had never made. Musical instruments with strings tuned to scales no one had heard before. In the oasis towns along the route, the air carried the scent of dates and wood smoke and the dry wind off the open desert. Back in China, the silk itself began in the quiet of late spring. The mulberry trees had leafed out, and on their branches the silkworms had been feeding. Small, pale, patient creatures, eating and spinning without hurry. When the cocoons were ready, the women carried them in shallow baskets to the workshop. Bronze cauldrons waited, filled with warm water. The cocoons were placed inside, and the water heated slowly, slowly, until the thread came free, one single unbroken thread, long and fine as a whisper. A single cocoon could yield 1,500 meters of thread. One continuous line of silk, drawn out so slowly and carefully that time itself seemed to pause. The looms that wove this thread were tall, sometimes 2 meters high, made of wood and bamboo, assembled in long sheds that held a row of them together. When they worked, the sound they made was rhythmic and low, a steady percussion, a slow heartbeat. The weavers moved in time with it, and the cloth grew, centimeter by centimeter, in the warm, dim air. And then, in the year 105 of the Common Era, something small and quiet changed the world. A court official named Kai Lun had been working on a problem. Bamboo strips were heavy, silk was expensive. There had to be something else, some material light enough to carry, cheap enough to share. He gathered tree bark, hemp fibers, old fishing nets, worn-out rags. He ground them fine, soaked them in water, poured the thin slurry onto a flat screen, and left it in the sun to dry. What lifted from the screen when it was dry was paper. Rough, a little yellowish, not beautiful exactly, but light as breath and humble as anything. It could hold ink, it could hold thought, it could be rolled, folded, carried in a sleeve. The first paper was nothing like what we think of now, but it held within it a kind of promise. A quiet revolution, the historians say, and that word quiet is right. It spread slowly, gradually, the way a good idea always does, through patience, through use, through the hands of many people over time. Along the same western roads that carried silk and saffron, something else was traveling eastward. Not a trade good, but an idea. Ancient, patient, carried on the backs of Kushan monks who walked for months across mountain passes and desert plains. They carried rolled sutra texts wrapped in cloth. They carried Sanskrit words for things the Chinese language had not yet needed to name. They were bringing Buddhism into China, and they would arrive, tired and dusty, in the city of Luoyang, where a small community was already waiting. By around 65 of the Common Era, there was a Buddhist community in Luoyang. Small rooms in early monastery buildings, the walls painted a soft celadon green, candles burning low on wooden shelves. The monks sat with sutras open before them, reading words in Sanskrit, a language of curves and breath, and trying slowly, patiently to find the Chinese words that might carry the same meaning. Word by laborious word, the translation came, and with it, a new way of thinking about suffering and stillness and letting go. Beyond the capital, beyond the monasteries and the silk workshops, most people lived in small villages. A cluster of mud brick houses around a shared courtyard, swept clean each morning, the dust pale on the dark earth. Inside the houses, women sat at small looms, weaving cloth for the family. Outside in the fields, men bent and rose with the rhythm of the growing season, planting in spring, tending in summer, harvesting in autumn. The cycle was old and steady and known. It had the feeling of something that would go on forever. In the corner of the village, beside a smooth old stone, stood a small shrine to the local earth deity, the Tushan, the spirit of the place itself. People brought offerings quietly, without ceremony, a handful of grain, a stick of incense. The smell of burning floated briefly above the rooftops and dissolved into the open sky. The deity asked for nothing elaborate, just to be remembered, just to be acknowledged by the people whose lives were rooted in that particular piece of ground. At the spring festival, paper effigies were made and carried to the courtyard. They were offerings, shapes folded and colored with careful hands, meant for the world beyond this one. When they were burned, the smoke rose in long, slow columns above the tiled rooftops into the early spring sky. The dogs slept in patches of sunlight near the entrance gate, one ear occasionally lifting, then settling again. The children watched the smoke rise with wide and wondering eyes. The elders watched it too and remembered other springs long before. In the workshops of the Han, other hands were at work on something slower and more deliberate than silk: lacquer work. A wooden or bamboo vessel would be set on a shelf and a thin coat of lacquer would be applied, smooth and even, worked in gently with a soft brush. Then the vessel was set to dry in a cool, dark room. When it was ready, another coat, then another. Sometimes 20 coats or more, each one waiting patiently for the last. The depth that came from this patience was unlike anything else. The most beloved color in Han lacquer work was vermilion red on black, a deep, still red, not bright or urgent, but rich and certain, the color of warmth without fire. A single bowl or tray might take months to complete. When it was finished, it held light on its surface in a way that seemed almost alive, a stillness that had been worked into it, layer by layer, over a long and patient season. The craftsman who made it might never see it used. It might travel westward on a cart, wrapped in cloth, to a table he would never see. Far to the east of the capital, in the town of Khufu, a temple had been built in honor of a man who had died 6 centuries before. Confucius had walked these streets, had taught beneath these trees, had spoken words that the Han government now enshrined as the foundation of governance, of learning, of how to live well with other people. Each spring, students and officials made the journey to Khufu to pay their respects. The approach to the temple was shaded by tall cypresses, ancient trees, their trunks wide and dark and sure. Beneath those cypress trees, the sounds of the world were muffled. Cartwheels, voices, the distant call of birds, all of it softened, as though the trees themselves were asking for silence. Inside the temple, incense burned before a bronze image of the master. The smoke rose slowly in the still air. The visitors stood quietly for a moment, heads bowed. There was no sermon, no instruction, only the burning incense and the old face of bronze and the knowledge that this is where it had begun, this long, slow project of trying to live rightly. And back in Chang'an, in the great audience hall of the palace, something extraordinary had occurred. Envoys from Parthia, a kingdom far to the west, beyond even the routes that Zhang Chan had traveled, had arrived bearing gifts for the Han emperor. The court assembled in formal robes, standing in their proper places. The beams of the palace hall threw long shadows in the midday light. And then the gifts were brought forward, carried in large wooden cages, and the court went very quiet. Inside the cages were creatures no one in Chang'an had ever seen. Ostriches, tall, strange, almost impossible, blinking their great eyes slowly in the unfamiliar light, and lions, amber-colored and enormous, their breath moving their sides in long, slow rhythms. The emperor sat still on his carved seat. The officials stood still in their silk robes. Everyone was very quiet for a moment, simply looking. The world was much larger than any of them had imagined, and here was the proof of it, breathing calmly in the middle of the room. That is the Han dynasty, resting now in your mind like something warm. A city 500,000 souls wide. A man who walked for 10 years into the unknown and came home with the world inside him. Silk threads drawn from warm water, paper drying in the sun, monks carrying words across mountains, lacquer drying in 20 patient layers, a bronze face in a cypress-shaded temple, and animals breathing in the quiet of a palace hall, while the whole court simply watched and was amazed. Let all of that settle now. The silk workshops have gone dark for the evening. The looms are still. The last thread has been wound onto its spindle, and the weavers have folded their hands and gone home. The lacquered bowls sit in their drying rooms in the cool dark, building depth and stillness coat by coat. The paper dries on its screens under a sky that has turned to purple. The sutras rest on their shelves, their Sanskrit curves patient as always, waiting for morning and the next slow word of translation. In the village, the dogs have settled back into their sleep. The shrine holds its small glow of incense in the dark. The courtyard is empty and quiet, the swept earth cool under the stars. In the fields beyond the wall, the grain stands in silence. The spring festival smoke has long since lifted and dissolved. The cypresses in Khufu stand in the dark without moving, the way they have stood for centuries, shading nothing but the night, asking nothing, requiring nothing, simply present in the way old and rooted things are present. Out in the desert, the caravans have stopped for the night. The camels have folded their long legs and settled into the sand, their breathing slow and rhythmic. The bales of silk are piled and covered. The saffron and the lapis lazuli are wrapped and resting. The desert wind moves over the dunes in a long, low sound, almost a voice, almost a lullaby. The stars over Dunhuang are extraordinary tonight. There are so many of them. The travelers have been watching them for weeks and still have not finished being amazed. And somewhere in a small celadon green room in Luoyang, a candle has burned down almost to nothing. A monk sits before an open scroll. His eyes are closing. The Sanskrit words blur gently on the page. He has been searching for the right Chinese word for something, some quality of stillness, some particular shade of peace, and he has not found it yet. He will look again in the morning. He closes the scroll carefully. He blows out the candle. The smoke rises in the dark, thin and warm, and then there is only the dark and the sound of the night and rest. The Han dynasty breathes slowly now, 500,000 people, and most of them sleeping. The boulevards of Chang'an are empty. The gate drum has long since spoken its one low note and gone silent. The great city rests inside its walls, orderly, wide, warm with the breath of many lives. You are resting too. Your breath is slower now. You do not need to hold on to any of this. Jiangqian is home. The silk is made. The paper is dry. You can let it all lie gently on the surface of your mind and let it go and drift. There is nothing you need to do. The dynasty is managing without you. The craftsmen are sleeping. The monks are sleeping. Waits sit still on their counters in the dark markets, waiting for morning. The ostriches in their palace cage are sleeping too, their long necks folded in some private bird dream. Even the lions are still, their great amber sides rising and falling, rising and falling. The palace hall is silent. The cypress trees in Qifu are motionless. The stars above the desert are very far away and very still and very, very many. Rest now. You have traveled far enough for one evening. And now, without quite knowing how, you have drifted forward through the centuries, the way a leaf drifts on a slow river, not rushing, not deciding, simply moving. The dynasties have turned like pages in a very old book. And here, settling gently around you now, is the Tang, a golden age, a long, warm afternoon in the life of a civilization. Close your eyes a little more. Let it come to you, Chang'an, the largest city in the world, more than 1 million souls living within its walls, and perhaps 5 times as many in the soft green land surrounding it. If you were to stand at its center and look outward, you would see rooftop after rooftop, courtyard after courtyard, street after straight street, all arranged with a kind of quiet geometry, the whole city laid out like a great calm grid beneath the open sky. The city was divided into 108 rectangular blocks, each one enclosed by its own low walls. They were called Fang, residential wards, each a small world unto itself, with its own lanes, its own wells, its own quiet routines. And every evening, as the lights softened and the sky turned the color of peach blossom, the ward gates were closed. The city folded inward, like a flower at the end of a long day. And in the morning the drums would sound, low and steady and carrying across the still air, the way a sound carries over water when everything else is quiet. At the first beats, the ward gates would open again. People would emerge slowly, vendors with their baskets, officials with their sleeves folded neatly, children trailing behind. The city would breathe in. The day would begin, gently, the way it always did. Let us follow the smell of something warm now. Down a long street, past a row of low inns, into a room where a fire burns low and pale green tea is being poured into small ceramic bowls. The Tang period was when tea became something more than a drink. It became a ritual, a practice, almost a philosophy. And a scholar named Lu Yu had written it all down, with great care, in a book called the Qing, the classic of tea. Lu Yu wrote about the temperature of the water, the particular kind of wood that should feed the hearth, the exact shape of the bowl, the way the steam should rise. Spring water was best, he said, ideally drawn from a mountain source, where the water had moved slowly through clean stone. Along the great highways of the Tang Empire, travelers stopped at roadside inns and drank small bowls of pale green tea before moving on. Simple, quiet, enough. And somewhere in that same golden empire, a man named Li Bai was writing poems. He wrote on moonlit mountains. He wrote on rafts drifting along wide rivers. He wrote at the wooden tables of inns by candlelight with ink that smelled of pine and stone. He wrote more than 1,000 poems in his life, and many of them have the quality of a breath, brief, effortless, and somehow weightless. They arrive and leave you feeling very quietly changed. He wrote, "I lift my head to gaze at the bright moon. I lower it and think of home." That is the whole poem. Just those 2 lines, and yet they hold inside them something very large. The weight of distance, the quietness of longing, the simple human habit of looking up at the sky when the heart is full. Li Bai knew that the largest feelings are sometimes best carried in the smallest words. Let those lines rest in you now, as the moon rests on still water. There was another poet in those same years. His name was Wang Wei, and he was also a painter, and also a court official, and also in his heart a hermit. He had an estate south of Chang'an, in a valley where a small river ran between bamboo groves and mossy stones. He called it Wang Chuan. It was a place of extraordinary quietness, ponds that caught the sky, paths of pale gravel, a small wooden hut beside the water where he would sit and not need to speak. Wang Wei wrote about the silence of pines in the rain, about moonlight falling on mossy stone, about the particular quality of the air in a garden after everyone else has gone to bed. His poems do not try to impress you. They simply stand beside you, the way a friend stands beside you when words are not quite necessary. In his paintings, the mountains were pale and soft, the distances were suggested rather than described, and the empty space was as important as anything he put into it. Now imagine walking west through Chang'an, toward the great market on the western side of the city. Even before you arrive, you can smell it, sandalwood and amber, leather and spice, something warm and resinous that you cannot quite name, but that makes you feel you are standing at the edge of a very wide world. The Western market was where the Silk Roads arrived, where the world beyond China came to rest for a moment before moving on. Sogdian merchants from Central Asia, Persian traders with dark eyes and wool robes, Arab merchants, Byzantine merchants, each one with their own stall, their own goods, their own language drifting into the general warm hum of commerce. Musical instruments from beyond the mountains were sold here. The pipa, a lute whose sound is round and warm like a voice not quite singing, and the konghu, a kind of harp whose strings trembled with a sound like water moving over smooth stones. Beyond the market, the city's wealth showed itself in other ways. In the tombs of the wealthy, ceramic figures were placed, horses and camels and musicians, each one glazed in 3 colors, orange and cream and turquoise, the glaze running slightly during the firing, producing something soft and marbled, like the surface of warm stone. They were called tang sankai, the 3-color ware, and they lay undisturbed in the quiet dark of those tombs for 1,000 years, as patient as anything can be. The horses stand as if paused mid-step, one hoof raised, their glazed eyes calm. The camels carry empty saddles, their necks arched in a permanent, dignified patience. The musicians are frozen in the middle of a note they will never finish. All of it was placed in the earth as an offering to the life being left behind, a memory of color and motion and warmth, kept safe in the dark for the soul's long journey. They have been found now. They are in the light again. In the hot months of summer, even the great city grew quiet in the middle of the day. After the midday meal, it was customary to rest, an hour of sleep called wujiao, the noon rest. Even officials set down their brushes. Servants folded away their tasks. The palace complex fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was sometimes the wind moving through the bamboo leaves in the inner garden. A slow, papery sound, like pages turning in a very large and unhurried book. For the summer rest, pillows of porcelain stone were used. Hard, yes, but cool against the cheek in the heavy heat of the afternoon. You lay down and felt the coolness of the stone move into you, drawing out the warmth of the day. The ceiling above was dark timber. The light through the latticed window was gold and still. The bamboo made its quiet sound outside. Sleep came not in a rush, but in a slow and courteous way, like a guest arriving without knocking. Now let your mind drift a little further out from the city, past its walls, past the farms and the orchards and the long roads. To the south of Chang'an lay the Qing hot springs, pools fed by thermal water that rose warm from deep in the earth, steaming in the cool air. Stone basins held the mineral-scented water. Jasmine grew in the surrounding gardens. In winter, imperial parties traveled there to rest in the warmth, while the cold air moved through the trees above them. In the evenings at Qing, lanterns were hung in the apricot trees. They glowed amber against the dark branches. The steam from the pools rose and drifted through the lantern light, and the whole garden had a quality that is difficult to name. Warm and cool at the same time, fragrant and clean, bright in small places and softly dark in others. It was the kind of evening where it seemed entirely possible to set down whatever you had been carrying and simply be still. And east of the hot springs, rising above the plain, stood the giant wild goose pagoda, the Dianta, 7 stories of pale stone reaching upward into the sky. It was built in 652, and monks worked there translating sacred texts from Sanskrit, their brushes moving slowly over long scrolls in rooms smelling of ink and lamp oil and old paper. The work was patient work, the kind of work that does not ask for thanks, that simply asks to be done carefully and well. In the evenings, wild geese flew over the pagoda in their long formations, the V-shapes moving slowly across the dusk sky, the way a thought moves slowly through a mind that is beginning to rest. Below, the sounds of the city would soften and dissolve, and from the pagoda, at the hours of prayer, wooden blocks were struck, a sound that carried across the rooftops, across the ward walls, across the wide, straight streets, until it reached the outermost walls and passed through them, out into the open fields beyond. And what of the young men who studied for the imperial examinations? They had been studying, some of them, for 10 years, 20 years. The 4 books and the 5 classics, the history of the dynasties, the forms of poetry, the precise order of a calligraphic stroke. They traveled from distant provinces to sit in the examination halls of Chang'an, each one given a small enclosed stall, a space just wide enough for a writing desk, just long enough to lie down. The examination lasted 3 days. The night between the sessions was spent in the stall, a candle burning, ink drying slowly on the stone, the candidate lying on the hard floor in the close dark, listening to the breathing of the other candidates in their stalls, all of them alone together in their silence, all of them carrying the same vast weight of preparation, the same hope, the same quiet willingness to keep going despite the exhaustion. Most would not pass. The examinations were rigorous and the number of positions was small, and the years of study were long. But even for those who did not succeed, there was the having studied. The years of sitting with the old texts, of learning the poems and the histories and the philosophies of a civilization that had been building itself carefully and continuously for a very long time. Something of that remained. Something always remains. The Tang dynasty lasted nearly 300 years. 300 years of poetry and tea and glowing lanterns and apricot trees. 300 years of ward gates opening to the sound of drums in the morning and closing softly at dusk. 300 years of geese flying over the pagoda in their unhurried formations, their wings beating in that slow, powerful rhythm that seems to say, "We know the way. We have always known the way. We are going there now." And now the drums have stopped. The ward gates are closed. The examination candles are burning very low, their flames steady and small in the closed dark. The monks in the pagoda have set down their brushes. The tea bowls in the roadside inns have been cleared away. Li Bai has lifted his head to look at the moon, and now he has lowered it again and gone to sleep, the way all poets eventually do, with a line still forming somewhere in the deep and dreaming mind. Wang Wei is in his garden at Wangchuan. The bamboo groves are dark and still. The pond holds the moon in it, a pale, soft circle on the black water. The small hut beside the water is dark. He is asleep, and the silence of the pines in the rain is moving over him like a blanket, like a hand passing gently over a lamp, like the particular peace that comes when you have looked at the world very carefully for a very long time and have decided, finally, that it is enough. The Sanchai horses stand in the dark of their tombs, patient as they have always been, the orange and cream and turquoise of their glaze invisible now, waiting for the light they do not need. The geese have landed somewhere in the reeds beyond the city. The Huaqing springs are steaming softly under the cold winter stars, and no one is watching them. And they are beautiful anyway, the way things are beautiful when they do not need to be seen. The drums will sound again in the morning. The ward gates will open. Someone will pour water into a small clay pot over a careful fire, the way Lu Yu instructed, and wait for it to reach exactly the right temperature, and pour it slowly over the pale green leaves, and carry the bowl to a table by a window, and sit down and hold it in both hands, and breathe in the steam. But that is morning. That is later. For now, the city is quiet, and so are you. Centuries pass the way water passes over stone, slowly, gently, wearing the world into new shapes. And now we arrive somewhere softer, somewhere quieter. The Song Dynasty, they called it, and it lasted for more than 300 years. It was not always a time of great armies or conquest. It was, in many ways, a time of turning inward, of refining small things until they became perfect, of learning that beauty does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits, held in the palm of your hand, Far to the south, in the Jiangxi province, there is a city cradled by rivers and red clay hills, Jingdezhen. Even now, the name carries a kind of warmth to it, like something held near a flame. In the Song period, dozens of kilns burned there through every hour of the day and night. From a distance, after dark, the smoke plumes rose into the sky like slow exhalations, pale columns drifting upward into a darkness scattered with stars. The whole hillside glowed softly, as though the earth itself were breathing. The craftsmen of Jingdezhen were working with something they called white gold, porcelain so pure, so carefully made, that when you held a finished bowl up to the light, it would seem to glow from within, thin as an eggshell, pale as moonlight through paper. A single celadon-glazed bowl might represent an entire year of a craftsman's life. The mixing, the shaping, the waiting, the fire, and then the opening of the kiln, and the lifting of the piece, and the long, slow exhale of relief when the glaze had settled perfectly. And then there were the rarest pieces of all. Ruware, made only for the Song emperors, kept only in the innermost rooms of the court. The glaze of ruware is a color that has no simple name, a blue that drifts toward gray, a green that drifts toward the sky just before snow falls. Imagine that color. That particular quiet moment when the clouds have thickened and the light has changed and the whole world seems to be holding its breath. That is the color. Fewer than 100 pieces survive in the world today. They were never struck to hear them ring. They were only ever held. Let the thought of that settle for a moment. Somewhere in the world tonight, behind thick glass in a quiet museum, one of those bowls sits in carefully controlled air. Someone made it with their hands more than 1,000 years ago. They smoothed the clay, they waited beside the kiln, they carried it through corridors of stone and silk, and it has outlasted every single person who ever touched it, and it is still the color of the sky before snow. Hold that thought gently as you breathe. Things made with care have a long, long life. In the same dynasty, a man named Shang was thinking about words, about how long it took a scholar to copy a single book by hand, and how many people might never read the text they deserved to read simply because there were not enough copies. And so around the year 1040, he made small individual pieces of baked clay, each one carrying a single character that could be arranged into any order, pressed into ink and pressed onto paper, and then rearranged and used again. The world's first movable type. The first time words became something you could hold in your hands and rearrange like quiet thoughts. After Bisheng's invention, books spread across China as they never had before. Poetry collections, farming guides, philosophical texts, medical knowledge, all of it moving along roads and rivers in bundles wrapped in cloth, carried on boats, passed between hands at market stalls and monastery doors. Imagine a farmer in a village he had never left, reading for the first time about mountains he would never see. Imagine a young woman reading a poem written by someone she would never meet, and feeling in those few still lines that she had been understood completely. That is what books do. That is what they have always done. Out on the sea, something new was happening. Song mariners had learned to magnetize a thin iron needle and float it on the surface of water in a small bowl. The needle would always turn gently to find north, a compass. So simple once you know it, so extraordinary when you first watch it happen. The needle drifting, searching, then settling into stillness, pointing quietly and certainly toward what it knows. With this small tool, ships could sail through nights with no stars, across open water far from land, and still know where home was. Song trading ships made their way across the Indian Ocean, past the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, through the warm straits into the deep blue waters that led toward the Persian Gulf and the east coast of Africa. Sailors on those ships carried silk and porcelain and spices. They slept in the creaking bellies of wooden vessels, under sails of woven bamboo matting. They woke before dawn to take readings, to check the needle, to watch the horizon lighten from black to purple to soft gold, the compass in its bowl of water still pointing home. Back on land, in the great northern capital of Kaifeng, a painter named Zhang Ziduan was making something extraordinary. Not a painting of an emperor, not a grand historical scene, but a scroll of ordinary life. The Qingming Shanghai Tu, roughly along the river during the Qingming festival. It stretches on and on, river boats and market stalls, children chasing each other across a wooden bridge, a man napping in an inn doorway, vendors calling out their wares, donkeys loaded with goods, scholars in robes arguing at a tea stall. A city of more than 1 million people, gathered into silk. Kaifeng was encircled by 2 ring canals that reflected the sky on clear days. Boats moved through them like slow thoughts. The city had restaurants open late into the night. It had booksellers and medicine shops and acrobats performing in open squares. In Zhang Ziduan's scroll, you can spend hours and still find new things. A man adjusting a donkey's load, a woman leaning from an upper window to watch the street below, 2 children playing with a hoop. A whole world, preserved in ink and pigment, still showing you its face more than 900 years later. In the same dynasty, there lived a man named Su Shi, though most people called him by his pen name, Su Dongpo. He was a poet, a painter, a calligrapher, a government official, and also, importantly, a cook. He was exiled more than once for saying things those in power did not wish to hear, and he accepted each exile with a kind of warm, amused patience. In his letters to friends, he was full of warmth and gentle irony. He liked to sleep late. He made his own wine, which was reportedly not very good, and drank it anyway. Su Dongpo is also credited with a dish still made today, Dongpo pork. Pork belly braised very slowly in wine and soy and sugar until the fat becomes yielding and glossy and the meat falls apart at the touch of chopsticks. He is said to have written a small poem about it, which is very much something Su Dongpo would do. He wrote poems about everything. About the moon he watched from exile, about a waterfall, about a friend's new bamboo grove, about eating lychees in the south, which he liked so much he said he could eat 300 in a day. There is something restful about Su Dongpo, the fact that a man of such learning and such difficulty moved from post to post by forces he could not always control, managed to remain curious and gentle and interested in pork. His essays about the moon are especially tender. He wrote one on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, when he had been separated from his brother for years, and the moon was full, and he said, "People have sorrows and joys, separations and reunions. The moon has its dark and light phases. Nothing has ever been perfect. All we can do is wish each other long life and share this same moon from far away." The painters of the Song period had their own way of looking at the moon, at mountains, at everything. Fan Quan painted mountains so vast they seemed to exhale. Guoxi painted winter trees whose branches twist like calligraphy written in a dream. Ma Yuan left his compositions deliberately unfinished, a fisherman on a tiny boat in the lower corner of a silk scroll, and above him, mostly empty space. Not empty meaning nothing, empty meaning everything else. Mist, distance, the vastness of what cannot be named. The small figure in the landscape, not diminished, but held. There is a word sometimes used to describe what those painters were reaching for. The sense that the empty space in a painting is not absence, but presence. That what is left out speaks as clearly as what is included. You can feel something like that right now in the quietness between thoughts. The space around each breath, the soft dark behind your closed eyes. Song painters knew that darkness is not nothing. It is where the imagination lives. It is where the mountains extend beyond the edge of the silk, into a distance the brush chose not to follow. Among the educated women of the Song period, there was a woman whose poems have lasted longer than almost any other voice from that time. Li Qingzhao. She was born in 1084, and she wrote about the things nearest to her: chrysanthemums in autumn, the smell of rain on stone, the sound of wind moving through bamboo, the ache of being separated from someone she loved. Her early poems are playful, even teasing. Her later ones carry a weight. She lost her home, her library, much of everything she had when northern armies swept through. But she kept writing. She could not stop. Li Qingzhao wrote, "I lie awake all night waiting for dawn." You can hear, in that line, both the particular woman and every person who has ever lain in darkness, waiting for the light to change. She was writing about loss and exile, and the weight of a night that would not end. And yet the line itself is so quiet, so plain. 6 words that carry a whole interior world. If you are still awake now, let those words settle softly over you. The night does not last forever. The light always comes eventually, pale and gentle, through whatever window is yours. When the northern capital of Kaifeng fell to invading armies in 1127, the Song court moved south to a city on the shore of a long, mirror-still lake, Hangzhou. The west lake, Shihu, was bordered by willow trees whose long branches trailed into the water. There were pavilions on small islands. There were lotus flowers that opened in the summer mornings and closed at dusk. Tea houses lined the lake's edge, their wooden floors extending over the water on low stilts, so that when you sat inside, you felt as though you were floating. In those tea houses along the West Lake, scholars would spend long afternoons doing very little by any urgent measure. They would drink tea brewed from the finest leaves grown on the hills nearby. Dragonwell tea, Longjing, with its clean, grassy fragrance. They would watch the willows move in the light off the water. They would recite poems from memory, poems by friends who had gone north or east or to other postings, as though the words themselves could close the distance. Sometimes a heron would pass overhead, low and slow, its reflection sliding across the lake. Marco Polo, who visited Hangzhou much later, wrote that it was the most beautiful city in the world. He was thinking of the canals, the stone bridges, the markets, the tea houses, the gardens, the way the lake changed color through the day. Silver in the morning, blue at noon, copper and rose at dusk. He was probably also thinking of the dumplings. Hangzhou had its own particular dumplings and noodles and slow-braised things, and Marco Polo ate them all and wrote about them in tones of considerable appreciation, which tells you something about the lasting power of a good bowl of something warm. Higher in the hills above the lake, in the ranges called Wuling, there were monasteries. Chan Buddhist monasteries, quiet places organized around a profound simplicity. The monks rose before the sun. They meditated in a long hall by the sound of a bell struck once, twice, 3 times into the darkness. Then there was garden work and cooking and study and silence. The gardens were made of 3 things: moss, stone, and bamboo, sometimes a single pruned pine tree. Water moved through the garden in a small stream, and in the early morning, that stream was the only sound in the world. Chan Buddhism taught that understanding could come not from reading more, not from arguing more, but from sitting very still and noticing what was already here. The sound of water, the weight of your own hands resting in your lap, the breath moving in and moving out without being asked. The monks in their mountain gardens were practicing a kind of attention that asked nothing to be different from what it was. Not the stream, not the moss, not the cold morning air, not the bell still fading into the dark. Just this, exactly this, which is, of course, a very restful way to understand the world. The Song dynasty lasted until 1279, when it was finally overtaken by the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan. But what it made, what it left behind, cannot be taken. The porcelain, the compass still pointing home across dark water, the printed books moving along roads between distant hands, the paintings with their vast empty mountains, the poems of Sudongpo watching the moon from exile, the poems of Li Qingzhao awake in the long night, all of it carried forward, thread by thread, into the world that came after. Some things, when made with enough care, simply do not end. And now, somewhere along the West Lake, the willows have gone still. The tea house lanterns have been blown out one by one. The scholars have walked home along the water's edge in the dark, their robes brushing the damp stones. A crane stands motionless at the lake's shallow margin, one leg raised, head tucked into its wing. The mist has come in from the hills and laid itself softly over the water. Everything is reflected and everything is still. The great song city breathes in its sleep, and the lake holds the last pale light from a sky the color of old porcelain. Up in the monastery garden, the stream runs over its familiar stones. The bamboo makes its small sound in whatever slight wind moves through the dark. The moss is cool and thick and holds the night's moisture like a soft memory. The monks are sleeping. The meditation hall is empty. The bell that was struck before dawn hangs in perfect silence now, still holding the echo of this morning somewhere inside its bronze. And the mountains stand as they have always stood, enormous, unhurried, patient beyond any patience a human life can name. They have been here before the dynasty. They will be here long after. Let your breathing slow now, the way the lake slows at the end of the day. Let your thoughts drift the way willows drift. Not going anywhere in particular, just moving gently in whatever quiet air is moving around you. You have traveled far tonight, through clay and fire and white gold porcelain, through printing houses and compass needles pointing north, through the warm words of a man who liked to sleep late and wrote poems about the moon, through the quiet ache of a woman writing by lantern light, through empty silk scrolls where the mountains go on forever past the painted edge into whatever comes next. In Jingdezhen, in the deep hours before the kilns are opened, the craftsmen sleep beside their work, waiting. Somewhere a compass needle rests in still water, pointing quietly to where it always points. On a shelf in a scholar's house, a book lies open, its printed characters holding someone's thought from 100 years ago, patient as stone, waiting to be read again. Li Qingzhao's chrysanthemums are silver in the moonlight. Sudongpo's wine is keeping warm beside a low fire, and the crane at the lake's edge has not moved. It will not move until dawn. It is simply here, which is enough, which has always been enough. The crane has not moved. It stands at the lake's edge in the moonlight, perfectly still, as if it has always been here and always will be. And perhaps it has. For the garden was already there, in that stillness, in that silver light on the water, in the mist that curls along the surface of the lake like something half-remembered. The garden was always already there, waiting to be named. Let us go back, gently, the way memory moves, not rushing, not arriving all at once. Let us walk slowly into the earliest gardens, those vast and dreaming spaces that emperors imagined into being, where the land itself was reshaped by 10,000 hands so that one man might feel the world was his. The Han Emperor's garden was not a small thing. It was not a quiet thing. It was a world made over in the image of ambition, stretching for miles beyond the palace walls. Mountains had been piled from earth and stone. Lakes had been scooped from dry ground and filled by channels running from distant rivers. This was not tending nature. This was commanding it. Deer moved through those parks in the thousands, unhurried, grazing on grass that had been planted for them. Cranes nested at the edge of constructed marshes. Strange trees had been brought from the south, their roots wrapped in cloth, carried for weeks on horseback, so that the emperor might look upon something he had never seen before. Even the unfamiliar was something to possess. Pavilions were built at the water's edge, where the emperor and his court might watch the surface of the lake move in the wind. The pavilions were lacquered red and gold. Their roofs curved upward at the corners like lifted wings. Inside, silk curtains shifted in the breeze, and somewhere, always, there was the sound of water, arriving from a channel just out of sight. These gardens said something. They said, all of this has been made for one man. The mountain obeyed him. The river obeyed him. The deer and the cranes moved through a landscape that would not have existed without his word. To walk in an emperor's garden was to understand, without being told, what power felt like when it pressed itself against the earth. But time is patient, and time has a way of turning the world towards smaller things. The Han passed into memory. Other dynasties rose and crumbled into the soft ground of history, and gradually, quietly, something shifted. A different kind of man began to think about gardens. A man who had seen the court and turned away from it and walked up into the hills with his brushes and his books. In the Eastern Qing, scholars began to make their gardens as moral statements. To choose a small garden in the hills was to choose something. It was a refusal, stated in pine trees and moss and still water. It said, I have been to the court, and I have seen what it is, and I prefer this. This quiet over that noise, this view of one cloud moving over one mountain over all the silk and ceremony of the palace. Tao Yuanming planted chrysanthemums, not to impress, not to command anything, simply because they bloomed in autumn and because autumn was honest, and because a man who had grown tired of performance needed something near him that did not perform. The chrysanthemum does not try to be gold. It simply opens when it opens. This was what a garden could mean, if you let it mean something small. The plum blossoms came even before winter had quite finished, in early spring, when the cold still lived in the stones. Their smell arrived before their color. You would be walking a path between rocks, hands cool at your sides, and then suddenly there it was, clean, faint, impossibly sweet, drifting through the gray air. The plum asked nothing of you. It simply reminded you that something was coming. By the Tang, the garden had settled into something graceful. Scholars and poets built villas south of the great cities, in river valleys where bamboo grew thick along the banks and the hills folded softly one behind another. They wrote about pines in the rain. They wrote about the sound a stream made passing over stone in the middle of the night. They were not describing places. They were describing states of mind. Think of the kind of garden Wang Wei had in mind when he wrote of pines in the rain. Not a grand thing, not a statement of empire, a path that turned and then turned again, a stone that had been placed beside water because someone felt it belonged there. A pine that leaned slightly over a shallow pool, and the pool that held the pine's reflection so carefully it seemed the water was listening. Water, stone, a pine, a path that turns. These were not decorations. They were an invitation to think slowly, to walk to the end of one thought and then, as the path bent, to begin another. The Tang garden understood that the mind needed corners, that wisdom did not arrive all at once, but quietly, around a bend, when you were not quite looking for it. And so we arrive gently at the song, the great age of the literati garden. Smaller now, more deliberate. The emperor's park had been mountains made to order. The Tang villa had been a valley chosen carefully. But the song scholar's garden was something else entirely. A miniature world, pressed into a courtyard, folded into itself like a letter that must be read slowly to be understood. The rocks came from Lake Tai, pulled from the water where centuries of waves had worn them into shapes no sculptor could have planned, full of holes, pitted and strange. Gray and weathered and alive with a kind of rough beauty that could not be purchased, only found. They were arranged to suggest mountains, to say with stone, here is a landscape you cannot walk into, but can imagine your way through. The path in a song garden was never straight. It turned, it narrowed, it passed through a moon gate that framed a single view, then turned again before you could hold on to it. This was philosophy made visible. Nothing should be seen all at once. The world is best understood in fragments: a petal, a shadow, the slow circle of a fish in dark water, one thing at a time. Koi moved in the shallow ponds of these gardens the way thoughts move when you are almost asleep, slowly, without urgency. Their shadows drifted across the pale sand at the bottom of the pool, overlapping, separating, drifting together again. If you watched long enough, you stopped thinking in words. You just watched the shadows. This, too, was the purpose of the garden. Still water held the sky so precisely that sometimes it was difficult to know which was real. A cloud would pass overhead, and you would see it first in the water, moving slowly across the dark surface of the pond, and then you would look up and find it there as well, the same cloud in two places at once. The garden multiplied the world, made it more than it was. In Suzhou, the private gardens grew more intricate still. The garden of the master of the nets, the humble administrator's garden. These were labyrinths of covered walkways and pavilions and bridges and gates, each one revealing only a portion of what lay ahead. You never saw the whole. You were never meant to. The whole was not the point. The fragment was the point. This view, here, now. The covered walkways shifted the light as you moved through them. Outside, the garden was open and bright. Inside the gallery, the light came in stripes through latticed windows, falling across the stone floor in patterns that shifted as you walked. Each window was a painting. Each turn of the walkway was a new composition. The garden was teaching the eye to slow down, to accept one thing before asking for another. Osmanthus grew near the covered galleries in autumn, its flowers so small they were almost invisible, its fragrance enormous and sweet and slightly warm, like something between honey and rain. You smelled it before you saw it, and after you had passed the tree, you could smell it still, clinging to your sleeve, following you down the stone path, past the moon gate, into the next small room of the garden. Bamboo grew along the walls of the enclosed courtyards, pressed close to the old stone, its canes leaning slightly inward, making a soft sound in whatever slight wind moved through the garden. Not a dramatic sound, not a warning, just a whisper of cane against cane, a small percussion, a reminder that even here in this still and deliberate place, something was always gently moving. Beyond the garden walls, from somewhere you could not quite locate, a single bird would call, not urgently, not repeatedly, just once or twice, then silence. The sound made the garden quieter by contrast. It reminded you that there was a world beyond this wall, beyond this path, beyond this carefully placed stone, and that you had chosen for now to be here instead of there. The choice felt like something. Somewhere beneath all this, the sound of water. Not a waterfall, nothing dramatic, just the quiet, purposeful sound of water finding its way through a stone channel, moving from one part of the garden to another, following a path that had been laid for it centuries ago. It was the sound of patience, of something small doing what it had always done, without asking why. Now the dynasties have done their slow work. The Han parks are grass and memory. The Jin hermit's hillside has grown over. The Tang villa has gone back to the earth. But here in Suzhou, the old gardens still hold their shapes, still bend their paths, still arrange their stones beside their dark, still ponds. Time has moved through them as water moves through stone, leaving something changed but unbroken. There is a bench, a small thing made of stone, pushed against a low wall in a corner of an enclosed garden. Moss has grown across its surface over many years, pale green and soft, the kind of soft that only comes from being left alone for a long time. The light comes in slantwise through bamboo, late in the afternoon, striping the moss in gold and shadow. Nearby, a small oval pond, dark water. Carp circling slowly, their orange and white shapes drifting without urgency beneath the surface, their shadows crossing the dark stone at the bottom. The water barely moves. A ripple begins somewhere near the channel's mouth and spreads outward in rings so gentle they are almost not rings at all, almost just a breathing. The sound of the water channel comes from somewhere out of sight, around a corner, behind a wall of bamboo. You cannot see it, you can only hear it. A small, patient sound, neither hurrying nor stopping, just continuing, the way things continue when they have found their right course. There is nothing to do here. There is nowhere to be. There is only this bench, this light, this moment suspended between what was and what will be. The moss is cool beneath your fingers, if you let your hand rest there. Cool and slightly damp, the way moss always is, as though it holds a little of every morning's dew inside itself throughout the whole day. The light leans further now. The shadows of the bamboo lengthen across the stone. A fish turns in the dark pond. Somewhere beyond the wall, the bird calls once and does not call again. You do not need to move. The garden does not ask you to. It has been arranged across all these centuries not to be finished, but to be rested in, to let the eye soften, to let the mind go quiet as the pond goes quiet when the last ripple reaches the edge and disappears. Something is about to begin, it always is. But for now there is only this late light, this bench, this small sound of water, just this. And so time moves gently forward, as it always does, the way a river finds its way around a stone without effort, without hurry. Centuries turn like pages in a book read slowly by firelight. New dynasties rise the way dawn rises, gradually, then all at once, then so thoroughly that you wonder how there was ever any darkness at all. The world of ink and silk gives way to something grander, something built from marble and ambition and the long patience of stone. In the north, on a great flat plain where the wind comes down long and cold from the steppes, a new city is being dreamed into existence. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, has looked at the old capital and decided he wants something more, something that will organize the sky itself into orderly squares. He calls it Khan Balik. Later the world will know it as Beijing. But for now, it is simply lines drawn in the dust, a dream of geometry, a city waiting to become itself. The city is built on the classical pattern, straight avenues running north to south, east to west, each intersecting at careful right angles, as though the emperor wished to impose order not just on people, but on the land beneath their feet. At the center of it all, a palace complex rises in white marble, its roof lines curving gently skyward. Ponds lie still in the palace gardens, their surfaces catching the winter light like pieces of a mirror someone has set carefully into the earth. A traveler arrives from very far away. He has been walking and sailing for years. His name, in his own language, is Marco. He steps through a gate and sees the palace of Kublai Khan for the first time. And even he, a man who has seen the markets of Persia, the deserts of Central Asia, the harbors of a dozen seas, goes quiet. There are no words sufficient to the moment, but he tries anyway. He writes of gold and silver on every wall, of floors of polished marble smooth as still water. Outside it is winter. Light snow drifts down over the frozen ponds, settling on the stones of the courtyard without a sound. Inside, fires burn in bronze braziers, casting warm amber light across the marble walls. The hall is very large and very still. Someone is pouring tea somewhere in the back rooms. The smell of smoke and cedar drifts through the corridors. Marco Polo sits and watches it all, turning it slowly in his mind like a jewel he is trying to understand. Far to the south, in a city called Jingdezhen, something beautiful is being born in the kilns. The craftsmen there have been making porcelain for generations, but now a new ingredient arrives along the Silk Road. Cobalt, deep and vivid, brought by traders from Iran in small parcels wrapped in cloth. The potters take it carefully, grind it with water and begin to paint. A dragon takes shape on a white vessel. Clouds form around it. A lotus blossom opens at the base. This is the birth of something the whole world will fall in love with. blue and white porcelain, that particular combination of deep cobalt and pure white that seems to hold both sky and snow at once. The patterns come from two worlds, the geometric rhythms of Islamic art and the flowing symbolism of Chinese tradition. Dragons and clouds and lotus blossoms, arranged in borders that echo mosque tile and garden wall. A new visual language, spoken in clay, understood everywhere. The years move gently on. A new dynasty settles like morning light across the land, the Ming, whose name means brightness. Under their long reign, China turns inward and also reaches outward simultaneously, as though the country itself is breathing deeply, expanding and contracting in a rhythm as natural as sleep. And in the year 1406, an emperor named Yongle looks at a flat expanse of earth in Beijing and decides to build something that will outlast every name he knows. 1,000,000 hands shape it. Carpenters come from the great forests of Sichuan in the south, where the timber grows tall and straight and smells of resin and old rain. Stonemasons travel from the Fangshan quarries, their hands already roughened by years of work. Glazemakers come from Jingdezhen with their secrets wrapped close. The timber beams float north on rivers, riding the current for months, resting against riverbanks at night, while the boatmen sleep beneath the stars. The floor tiles of the Forbidden City are fired so dense, so thoroughly compressed, that even now, 6 centuries later, if you tap them with your knuckle, they ring. Not like hollow wood, not like ordinary stone. They ring with a low, clear tone, like a bell heard from a great distance, like something remembering what it was made for. The craftsmen who fired those tiles are long gone, but the sound they made possible is still here, still ringing, patient as the city itself. And while the Forbidden City was rising stone by stone in the north, something else was being prepared in the south, down by the wide mouth of the Yangtze, where it opens toward the sea. At Nanjing, in the shipyards along the river, workers were building something extraordinary, a fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen. The ships were enormous, longer than a city block. Their railings were lacquered deep red. Their sails were made of silk so large they could fill a field. The admiral who commanded this fleet was a man named Zheng He, a tall man, by all accounts, steady and observant, the kind of person who could hold a very large thing in his mind and not be overwhelmed by it. Between 1405 and 1433, he led 7 great voyages, 7 departures from the mouth of the Yangtze, 7 returns. The fleet sometimes numbered more than 200 ships, moving together across the Indian Ocean like a slow and magnificent cloud. They sailed to Southeast Asia, to India, to the Persian Gulf, to the coast of Africa. At each port, the arrival of the treasure fleet must have been astonishing. Those enormous red hulls appearing on the horizon, the silk sails catching the sun, the sound of the fleet's drums drifting across the water before the ships even became fully visible. They brought silk and porcelain. They received spices, ivory, Arabian horses, and the goodwill of distant kings who sent their own ambassadors back to China. And then in the year 1414, something truly extraordinary was unloaded at the gates of the Forbidden City. It had traveled a very long way. It walked slowly, which is its nature. Its neck was so long it seemed to be examining the roof lines with genuine curiosity. The court scholars looked at it and nodded to one another solemnly. This was the Qilin, the mythical creature that appeared only in times of great virtue, the good omen that came once in a dynasty if you were very fortunate. It was, of course, a giraffe. But perhaps the court scholars were not entirely wrong. There is something mythical about a giraffe when you are seeing one for the first time, when no painting or story has prepared you for the slow grammar of its movement, the way it places each foot with such unhurried confidence, as though it has all the time in the world, as though time itself is a courtesy it has been shown and intends to repay. It walked through the gate of the Forbidden City, and the whole court went quiet. Not far away, running the length of China from south to north, the Grand Canal moved its slow and endless traffic. It is the longest man-made waterway in the world, and it has been moving grain and silk and salt for longer than most dynasties can remember. Under the Ming, it was rebuilt and deepened, its lock gates fitted with new timber, its towpaths lined with willows that trailed their fingers in the current as the grain boats passed beneath them, loaded low in the water, heading north. The lock keepers lived in small houses right at the water's edge. They spent their days listening to the canal, the sound of water pressing against the lock gates, the creak of the wooden levers, the soft thump of a boat nosing against the stone walls. At night, they could hear the frogs in the reeds and the distant splash of fish. The water never fully went quiet. Even at 3 in the morning, when everything else was still, the canal was whispering to itself, finding its way north. And in the province of Hubei, in mountains that rose from the mist, like something half-remembered from a dream, the Ming emperors built temples. The Wudang Mountains were sacred Taoist ground, and the emperors treated them with great care, ordering the construction of monasteries on the peaks, connected by stone stairways that wound up through cloud and forest. Even today, those stairways are sometimes invisible in the mist. You can hear the stone steps before you see them, solid under your foot, certain. The monks who lived on those peaks had a particular practice. Each morning, before the mist had fully lifted, they would gather in the courtyards of the temple and begin to move. Slowly. So slowly that you might think, watching from a distance, that they were standing still. This was Taijiquan, a way of moving that was also a way of praying, a way of understanding how water moves, how air moves, how the body can become the shape of its own quietness if you give it enough time and attention. Their movements were like water flowing over stone. Unhurried, each gesture completing itself fully before the next one began. The hand rises, it holds, it turns, it descends. The weight shifts from one foot to the other with such care that there is no sound at all, no creak of floorboard, no scrape of sandal. Just the breathing of many people moving in the same rhythm, the mist moving around them, the morning coming on by degrees, the way all good things come, gradually and then completely. Down in the workshops of Beijing, other hands were bent over other kinds of careful work. The art of cloisonné had been refining itself for decades, and the craftsmen who made it were among the most patient people in a city not short of patience. They worked with copper vessels and very thin wire, bending the wire into patterns, pressing it gently into the surface, filling each tiny cell with enamel paste in colors so saturated they seemed to hold their own light: turquoise, cobalt, vermilion, deep forest green. The work required a very steady hand, not just steady in the sense of not shaking, steady in the deeper sense, steady in the way a person becomes steady after years of practice, when the hand and the eye have learned to trust each other completely. The craftsmen bent over their work for hours, filling one cell, then the next, then the next. The colors built up slowly, like a garden coming into bloom, like a conversation that takes a whole afternoon and arrives somewhere true. The bowls and vases and candlesticks that came from those workshops held a particular quality of stillness. They were objects that asked to be looked at slowly. You could spend a long time on a single cloisonné bowl, following one vine as it curled around the base, finding where the pattern completed itself, noticing how the wire caught the light differently depending on the angle. They were objects made for the kind of attention that is also a form of rest. The eye moves and the mind goes quiet. But all things, even the most beautiful, move through their seasons. The Ming dynasty was long, nearly 300 years. And like all long things, it contained its own slow unraveling within it, the way a great tree contains its own eventual falling in the soft wood at its heart. The signs came quietly, tax revenues that did not quite add up, garrisons at the northern borders that thinned a little each year as the old soldiers aged and fewer young ones came to replace them. In the imperial villas, the gardens grew a little quieter each decade. The gardeners who had kept the paths immaculate were not always replaced when they retired. Moss began to find the cracks between the stones and settle there slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way all soft things find the edges of hard things and wait. A pond might go unraked for a season. Leaves would gather in the corner of a courtyard. These were small things, but small things accumulating become the shape of an era's end. The last Ming emperor was a man who had not wished for the weight he inherited. In the final year of his reign, as forces gathered outside the city walls, he walked alone through the Forbidden City, through those great courtyards where once the tribute animals had walked, where the giraffe had moved with its ancient, unhurried grace, and climbed to the top of Jingshan Hill, the small hill just north of the palace, where the view of the whole city opened around him like a slow exhalation. He could see the rooftops of the Forbidden City below him, those golden tiles he had never chosen, catching the last of the afternoon light. He could see the canals, the courtyards, the gardens where the moss had come. He could see in the far distance the mountains to the north, still and blue, and utterly indifferent in the way that mountains always are. The city was very quiet. Everything he was looking at had been built by people who believed it would last forever, which is the most human thing of all. And yet here we are. The Forbidden City is still standing. The Grand Canal still moves its quiet water north. In Jingdezhen, kilns are still burning, and blue and white porcelain is still being painted with the same dragons, the same lotus blossoms, the same clouds that learned to float across a white vessel in the Yuan dynasty. When a cobalt pigment arrived in a cloth parcel from Iran, and someone looked at it and thought, yes, this is the color I have been waiting for. That is one of the things China teaches if you listen to it long enough. That things last. Not because they are unchanging. The dynasty ends, the garden grows moss, the fleet is called back to harbor, and its great sails furled and never unfurled again. But because what was made with care carries something of that care forward through time, even when the hands that shaped it are dust. The giraffe that walked through the gate of the Forbidden City is gone. But somewhere in the archives there is a painting of it, patient and tall, still arriving. Let your breathing slow now. Let the images settle like sediment in still water. The white marble palace and the snow, the cobalt dragon on its white vessel, the lockkeeper's lantern beside the canal. The monks in the mountain mist, their hands turning like water over stone. The great red ships on the open ocean, their silk sails full of a warm and ancient wind. These things happened. They were real. They were lived by people who also grew tired at the end of the day, who also welcomed the quiet. The canal is still now. The lock gate is closed. The grain boats lie quiet in the water, their ropes slack, their cargo resting. Along the bank, the willows have stopped moving. The frogs are finished with their singing for tonight. Somewhere very far away, on a mountain that is mostly cloud at this hour, a monk is sitting completely still, the way the mountain sits still, the way the mist sits still, waiting for the morning without impatience, without effort, simply being present with the dark and the quiet and the cold stars overhead. You can rest now. You have traveled very far. From the geometric streets of Kanbalik to the porcelain workshops of Jingdezhen. From the great shipyards of Nanjing to the coast of Africa and back again. From the gold-decorated halls where Marco Polo sat by a bronze brazier to the mountaintop temples where the morning mist moves through the courtyard as though it lives there, as though it has always lived there. All of it is behind you now. All of it is resting, the way everything rests eventually. The cloisonné bowl on the scholar's shelf holds the last of the candlelight in its turquoise cells. The canal whispers to itself in the dark. The floor tiles of the forbidden city ring with that low, clear note if you tap them, but no one is tapping them tonight. Tonight, they are simply there, dense and patient, holding the weight of the past without complaint, as they have for 600 years, which is a long time to hold anything, and which they will continue to do long after this night is over. Let the great silk sails fill with whatever wind is left in you. Let them carry you out past the harbor, past the red lacquered railings, past the sound of the drums that signaled departure. The ocean is very smooth tonight. The stars are doubling themselves in the water below. The treasure fleet moves as one, quietly, without urgency, toward a horizon that will not be reached before you are fully asleep. Which is all right. The horizon will be there tomorrow. The voyage continues without you needing to watch it. Sleep now. Somewhere a fire is being laid, not a grand fire, just the small, careful kind. Paper and kindling and a breath blown gently at its edge. A woman is cleaning the last corner of a room she has cleaned 100 times before. Outside, the night is cold and very still. The year is almost done. And in the doing of these small things, in the sweeping and the laying of fires and the folding of quilts, the world is being made ready to begin again. This is the other kind of time, not the kind that moves toward a horizon, the kind that returns. The year is a wheel. It has always been a wheel, and if you are very still, you can feel it turning beneath you. Slow and even and sure, the way the earth turns without asking anything of you at all. Spring festival, the Lunar New Year. It has come again. It always does. Before dawn, the city is quiet in the particular way that follows noise, a quiet full of echoes, full of the memory of sound. The stones are cold. The street is scattered with red paper, torn and damp, pressed flat against the ground like fallen petals. The lanterns are still swaying. Not much. Just the slight, patient sway of something that has burned all night and is not quite finished. Their light is softer now, amber and low, blurring gently at the edges in the cold morning air. The street does not need them anymore. They sway anyway. In the kitchen, someone is up early. There is the sound of water, the sound of dough being folded. Dumplings are steaming. The smell of them fills the whole house, warm flour and pork and a faint green note of chive. The windows have fogged at their edges. The family is still sleeping and they are being fed already before they wake. A child's hands, small and still half asleep. And pressed into them, a red envelope, thin and bright and warm from being held. Lucky money, a wish passed from one set of hands to another. The child does not fully understand it yet. That is all right. The understanding comes later. The warmth is already there. The house has been cleaned to its bones. Every corner swept, every surface cleared of the old year's dust. And now it is being filled again, with food and paper and light and people. A house cleaned and then warmed. There is something very old in this, something that does not need explaining. You have felt it too, probably. The relief of a clean beginning. The year is new, which means it is also old. The same, the cycle, completing itself and beginning again, the way a river empties into the sea and becomes rain and becomes a river again. No beginning that is not also a continuation. The red paper on the ground this morning was hanging bright last night. Next year, it will hang bright again. Qing comes in early spring, when the air is still cool and the light is still new. Families walk out of the city in the morning, unhurried, carrying things, incense, paper, sometimes food. The grass on the hillsides is pale from winter, just beginning to remember how to be green. The sky is a soft, featureless gray. It may rain later. It often does. Willow branches are tucked into doorways as the families pass out of the gate, long and drooping and just beginning to yellow-green. They are meant to keep wandering spirits from following the family home. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps the willow branch in the doorway is just a way of saying, we went out, we came back, we remembered. At the gravesite, paper is burned, not dramatically, just a small fire, carefully made, tended with a stick. A thin column of smoke rises straight up in the still air. The family stands around it, not quite speaking, not quite silent. The smoke carries the offerings upward: paper money, paper food, paper things shaped like the things the living use. A conversation conducted in smoke. There is a smell to this festival: spring rain on cold stone, incense and wood smoke, and the faint green smell of the earth just waking. It is not a sad smell. It is more careful than that, more honest. The smell of a season that has not quite decided to be warm yet, standing at the edge of becoming. In paintings of Qing going back 1,000 years, the willows look the same. Long, trailing, indifferent to dynasties. They were there when the Tang poets walked past them. They were there in the song scrolls, rendered in ink with 3 quick strokes. They are there now, in whatever now you find yourself in. The willow does not change for anyone. It just continues, greening every spring the same as it ever was. The 5th month arrives with heat, midsummer, the Dragon Boat Festival. In the kitchen, bamboo leaves are being laid flat on a table, soaked soft and dark green. Glutinous rice, sticky and white, is spooned into them. The leaves are folded around it, carefully, then tied with reeds. There is something very satisfying about this. The small, deliberate wrapping of one thing inside another. They go into boiling water. They come out changed, denser, darker, the rice pressed into the shape of the leaves that held it. And when you unwrap one, the smell rises first, green and slightly bitter and deeply, warmly familiar. The bamboo smell released. It is the smell of this particular festival and no other. You would know it anywhere. Wormwood hangs in the doorways in this month, tied in bundles, pungent and medicinal. The hot season is also the season of bad air, of illness. The wormwood is a precaution and a sign. Summer is here, the serious summer, the kind that requires attention. On the river, the boats move in long lines. You can hear them from here, or almost hear them. The sound of water. There is a poet underneath the water. That is the story behind this festival. A poet who drowned, and the people who threw rice into the river to keep the fish away from him, to keep him whole. It is not a story that needs retelling here. It is just a feeling. A tenderness toward rivers, toward the people the rivers have taken. The rice still being thrown, year after year, in his memory. The 15th night of the 8th month. The moon. Not just any moon. This one is the fullest and the closest seeming of the whole year, the harvest moon that hangs so low it seems to be resting in the treetops. The night is clear and warm, and the air smells of the last of the summer heat leaving the stone. Mooncakes, round and dense, pressed with patterns on their golden crusts, flowers, characters, a rabbit. Filled with lotus seed paste or the bright orange surprise of a salted egg yolk at the center, rich and unexpected and somehow exactly right. Wrapped in oiled paper, they are left on tables and window ledges and passed between hands. Small, serious, beautiful things. Families are sitting outside, on rooftops, on steps, on mats laid in the courtyard. The moon is big enough to read by, though no one is reading. They are just watching it. 1,000 years ago, a poet lifted his head to look at it and missed, with an ache he turned into verse, the people who were far away. You have probably felt that ache. It is the same moon. There is always someone who is not there. The festival marks their absence as clearly as their presence, because the table is set as if they might arrive. The mooncake put aside for them. This is not grief exactly. It is more like acknowledgement, a way of saying, you are still counted. The circle still has your place in it. Under every dynasty, they watch this moon. Han, Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming. The names change at the top and the moon rises anyway, full and unhurried, over every rooftop in every city of the empire. The people sitting outside are not thinking about dynasties. They are eating mooncakes and watching the sky and feeling the peculiar fullness that belongs only to this night. Winter comes. The nights lengthen. The Dongji festival arrives on the longest night of the year, not with noise but with warmth. Warmth gathered deliberately, on purpose, against the dark. In the kitchen, small balls of glutinous rice are being rolled between palms. Tangyuan, white and round and satisfying to the touch, each one smooth as a small wish. They go into sweet soup, ginger or red bean, or simply sugar, and they bob there, softening. The family gathers around a low table. The steam rises. Outside, the night is very long. Inside, the bowl is warm in both hands, and the soup is warm in the throat. And the people sitting close together are warm against each other without quite touching. This is the dark center of the year, and the gathering itself is the meaning. We made it here, to the longest night. We are still together. The light will return now. It always does. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight is for the soup and the closeness and the steam and the staying. The year is folding in on itself, like hands folded in a lap, like a quilt folded at the end of a bed, like a letter folded and put away, not thrown away, put away carefully where it can be found again. The year has been long and full, and now it is gathering itself into this warm room, this steam, this soup, these people, and becoming still. All of it. The red paper on cold stone, the willow in the doorway, the bamboo leaves and their green smell, the mooncake pressed with flowers, the small rice balls in sweet soup. None of it required permission. No dynasty issued it, no emperor invented it. It was simply what the year did, and what the people did, inside the year, century after century, unasked. The Han lit the lanterns, the Tang lit them, the Song and the Yuan and the Ming. And in between the dynasties, in the long, quiet years that history does not record because nothing was conquered and nothing was declared, ordinary people swept their floors and cleaned their rooms and rolled small round things between their palms and watched the full moon from their rooftops and turned the wheel. The wheel turns without asking. The spring comes back. The moon fills and empties and fills again. The rice is wrapped in leaves and the smoke rises from hillsides in early April, and the soup steams on the longest night. This is the oldest thing, older than any name at the top, older than the wheel itself, probably. Just this. And so the fleet drifts on and we drift too, carried by the same slow current of centuries. The dynasties do not end so much as they soften, like the edges of old stone worn smooth by rain and passing hands. Something new is always arriving from the north, from the hills, from the great open distances beyond the wall. And now, in the long amber light of a later age, riders come down from Manchuria, a people who know horses, who know forests, who know the cold smell of pine and open sky. They came quietly, as such things always seem to in memory. The Qing riders, banner after banner, moving like colored clouds across the plains. They did not tear down what they found. They stepped into the forbidden city, as one steps into a hall where the furniture has already been arranged, carefully, respectfully, learning the language of the rooms. The court rituals remained, the ancient sequences of bowing and offering, the incense and the bells. Only small things changed. A braid, a banner, a second language murmured in the council chamber. In the mornings, before the court was awake, an emperor might walk out alone into the garden, not the forbidden city with its stone courtyards and rigid symmetry, but the other place, the softer place beyond the city walls. The Yuanming Yuan, they called it, the garden of perfect brightness. 350 hectares of water and rock and quiet, more than 100 buildings scattered like thoughts across the landscape, connected by paths that wound between willows and pavilions and wide still lakes. Emperor Yongzheng preferred this garden to the palace, and perhaps that is easy to understand. if you have ever stood at the edge of a lotus pond in the early morning, when the air is cool and the blossoms have just opened, and the only sound is the occasional soft drip of water from a leaf. He would pass along the paths while the court slept. The gravel was pale. The lotus flowers were pink at the edges, white at the center. The world was very large and very quiet, and he was only a man walking in a garden. Let the garden hold you for a moment. Feel the gravel beneath your feet, cool and even. The willows trail their fingers in the water. A heron stands at the far edge of the lake, utterly still, as if it has always been there and will always be there. The distant buildings are roofed in green and blue tile, just visible through the trees. A waterway runs beneath a small stone bridge, and the sound the water makes as it passes under, that low, gentle murmur, is the same sound water has always made in every century. Far to the south, in the city of Jingdezhen, the kilns burned all night. They had burned for centuries, and under the long reign of Emperor Kangxi they burned with particular purpose. The ceramicists had found new colors, greens and pinks of a depth and clarity that had never quite been achieved before. Famille verte, famille rose. The glazes went on in layers so thin they were almost like light, and when the piece came out of the kiln and cooled, it held a color you felt rather than simply saw, something that lived inside the surface of the porcelain. The finest pieces were wrapped in rice straw and placed in wooden cases, and couriers carried them on the road north to Beijing. Imagine them resting for a night at a roadside inn, these fragile objects so carefully packed, so quietly traveling. The straw held them gently. The cases were sealed, and somewhere inside the padding, a cup or a vase lay in perfect darkness, its glaze already set, its color already complete, simply waiting to be seen by the eyes it was made for. And then there is Suzhou. Even to say the name is to feel something settle. Suzhou, city of gardens and silk and slow water. The city sits threaded with canals, and its private gardens are labyrinths, not meant to be understood all at once, but discovered in pieces. You turn a corner and there is a pond. You follow a covered walkway and there is a pavilion. You step around a cluster of shaped rock, and suddenly the sky opens above a courtyard you didn't know was coming. This is the design. Always a fragment, never the whole. The garden of the master of the nets. The humble administrator's garden. These names hold something inside them, a kind of deliberate modesty that is itself a form of beauty. The master of the nets was a fisherman or someone who wished to be thought of as one. The humble administrator simply tended his garden and let the world govern itself. The rock formations were chosen for the shadows they cast at different hours. The ponds were shallow enough to reflect the sky, but still enough to hold the reflection for a long time. The silk workshops ran behind garden walls and down narrow streets. The looms were large wooden things, and the sound they made was rhythmic, almost like breathing. Thread after thread, color after color. Suzhou silk had a particular weight to it, not heavy, but present. A shawl of Suzhou silk lies against the skin differently than anything else, and the workers knew every thread they sent out into the world, knew which hand had passed which shuttle, which knot had been tied by lamplight at what hour of the evening. Now rest here for a moment. Feel the weight of silk, imaginary and soft, settling over you like the last layer of warmth before sleep. The loom is quiet now. The garden is very still. There is tea on the table, and it is still warm, and you have nowhere to be. The tea ceremony under the Qing had become a kind of meditation. Every step had its name, its moment, its purpose. First the cups were warmed, hot water poured in, swirled, poured out. Then the dry leaves were placed, and you were meant to smell them before any water touched them. Longjing tea from the hills near Hangzhou, Biluochun from Suzhou, rolled into small spirals that unfurled slowly in the water. The first pour was always discarded. It was only for washing, for opening. The true tea came second. The water had to be the right temperature, not boiling. Green tea bruises in water that is too hot. The ceramicists who made the cups understood this. The cups were thin enough that you could feel the heat of the tea through the walls without burning your fingers, a warmth that was just exactly enough. Imagine holding such a cup now, the warmth traveling up through your palms, the pale green of the tea, the slight sweetness at the back of the throat, clean and simple, like early morning air. In the imperial sewing workshops of Beijing, women bent close to their work in the candlelight. The ceremonial robes of the emperors and their families were made here, and making one robe could take months. A single golden dragon on dark silk, each scale stitched individually with thread so fine it caught the light differently than the thread around it. Purple clouds drifting across the chest. Along the hem, blue silk waves that moved almost like water when the robe was worn and the wearer walked. The needleworkers' faces were very close to the fabric. They could see, by the end of a long session, exactly where the light fell on each completed stitch. They knew the robe's weight before it was finished, could feel the silk under their fingers, could judge by touch alone whether a section was even. And when the robe was done and folded and carried away, and they never saw it again, that was all right. The work itself had been enough. The months of mornings and evenings bent over that silk, following the dragon's scale by careful scale. Far to the south, along the Pearl River, the foreign ships had come to rest. From 1757, they were only permitted to trade through Canton, Guangzhou, and the trading houses of the Dutch and the British and others stood in a long row along the riverbank, their flags hanging still in the evening air. The Kohong merchants were their intermediaries, and the system was orderly, and at certain hours of the evening it was possible to forget about systems entirely and simply watch the river. The ships lay still in the harbor as evening deepened. Their hulls made soft sounds against the water, a low rhythmic tapping, like something patient and sleepy waiting for morning. The banyan trees along the bank held night birds that called now and then fell quiet. The sound of the river was constant and low. The trading houses showed candlelight in their upper windows. Somewhere a bell rang once and was not answered. The harbor breathed in its own slow way, and the water moved past all of it, westward, then south, toward the open sea. And then there is a long covered walkway along the edge of a lake, 728 meters of it, painted on every beam and panel with scenes from landscapes and stories and seasons. Each panel different, each panel a world. This was the Empress Dowager Cixi's favorite promenade, along Kunming Lake at the Summer Palace she had rebuilt after the old garden was burned. She walked here in the evenings slowly, as one walks when one has governed an empire for decades and has earned the right to move without urgency. The western hills were visible from the far end of the walkway. In the evenings they turned from green to gray to a pale violet, and then the sun dissolved into the surface of Kunming Lake, spreading out in colors that moved with the water. Cixi watched this. For all the weight of what she carried, the edicts, the regencies, the long years of governance, in this moment she was simply watching the sun go down over a lake, the same way people have always watched it, in every age and every country, with the same quiet inside them. The sun touches the water and spreads. Let it spread through you as well. All that gold and rose, dissolving at the edges, becoming simply warmth and then simply light, and then simply the feeling that the day has been long and the evening has come and everything is settling. The lake accepts the light without holding on to it. The hills receive it and let it pass. Even the painted panels on the walkway dim slowly, their scenes blurring into softness as the last brightness fades. This is how evenings end here, gently, without announcement. And then there was a morning in February 1912. A small boy, 6 years old, sat in a hall he had always lived in but perhaps never quite understood. His name was Puyi, and he was the son of heaven. And on this morning a decree was read aloud that ended more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. The hall was not full. The courtiers who gathered were not many. The words of the decree were formal and measured, as such words always are. The imperial seals were placed in their silk pouches, and the pouches were closed. The curtains in the throne room were drawn and remained drawn. Outside, the forbidden city was quiet. The courtyards held only the same stones they had always held, pale and enormous. The same roof tiles caught the same pale winter light. A sparrow landed on the ridge of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, as sparrows always had, and found nothing changed. The city within the city went on existing, its gates closed now to a world that had moved past it, while inside its walls a boy and a dwindling court lived on in a silence that was neither sad nor happy, only still. 12 more years he lived there, that boy who had been emperor, and the city held him quietly, the way old places hold the last remnants of what they once were, not clinging, not sorrowful, simply present. The guards changed. The seasons passed over the yellow rooftops. Spring brought wisteria to the inner gardens. Summer brought heavy rains that drummed on the tiles. Autumn laid red leaves across the courtyards, and they blew into corners and stayed there. Winter silenced everything under pale sky, and the stones held the cold a long time after. And now we come to what remains. Not ruins. China does not ruin easily. The pagodas still stand, their tiers rising in the same proportions they always did. Each roof curving up at the corners as if asking a question of the sky. The gardens have been restored, the ponds refilled, the lotus planted again in the same places where lotus has always grown. The characters carved into the walls of temples are the same characters that were pressed into oracle bones 3,000 years ago, by hands that were asking the future what it held. It is not a line. This civilization, it never was. A line can be broken, can end. What China built over those 3,000 years and more is something more like a river, the kind of river that is wide in some places and narrow in others, that floods sometimes and runs slow in dry years, that carries silt and stone and the seeds of plants from one place to another without knowing it is doing so. The kind of river that does not stop because of what has happened to it, only changes course, only finds the lower ground, only moves forward. Always yellow, always moving. That is the Huanghe. That is what all rivers know. The water does not remember the ice it was or the rain that fell into the mountains before it gathered into flow. It only moves. And in moving, it carries everything. The silt from old fields, the minerals from old stone, the warmth from summer days long past. It does not try to carry these things. It simply does, because water and time are the same kind of substance, and everything that enters a river eventually reaches the sea. Let yourself be carried now, the way the river carries everything. The dynasties pass. The emperors pass. The poets set down their brushes and the potters let their fires cool, and the silk workers fold the last length of cloth and go home in the evening. The tea cools in the cup. The incense finishes. The candle in the workshop gutters once and then holds steady again, a small flame in a very old room, giving its light to whatever is near. You have traveled a long way tonight, through river valleys and walled cities, through courts of jade and rooms of bronze bells, through markets full of silk and spice, through the silence of scholars and the quiet of garden stones. You have walked along the Great Wall at dusk and watched treasure ships move into open sea. You have held a bowl of green tea whose warmth passed through the celadon into your hands. You have listened to the looms and the kilns and the soft sound of a brush moving across a page. You have been here before, in all the ways that matter. The oracle bones ask their questions in the earth. The bronze vessels hold their shapes. The garden stones lean in the same directions they have leaned for centuries. The same moon that rose over the Tang poets rises now over the restored garden paths, over the restored ponds, over the same lotus that has been planted and replanted and planted again. It is all still here, and you have been part of it tonight in the only way a sleeping person can be, completely, without effort, carried along by the river of it. Let the moonlight settle over the water. Let the water hold its reflection without effort. The moon does not ask the water to be still. The water is simply still, and the reflection comes on its own, naturally, the way sleep comes when you stop reaching for it. There is nothing to understand tonight, nothing to remember. The river flows whether or not you are watching it. The garden exists whether or not you are walking through it. You can simply be here, in this warm and quiet place, at the edge of something ancient and gentle. The curtains are drawn in the old hall. The fire is low. Somewhere in the distance, very faint, the sound of a night bird in a banyan tree. One call, and then nothing. The silk pouches are closed. The seals are at rest. The court has retired. The boy emperor sleeps in his quiet city within the city, and the city sleeps around him, and the great wall sleeps along its mountain ridges, and the kilns are dark, and the looms are still, and the river moves on without making any sound that needs to be heard. Sleep now. The journey is complete and also never-ending, which is the nature of all real journeys. You have done nothing wrong and forgotten nothing important and missed nothing that will not find you again. The river goes on. The pagodas stand in the morning that is coming somewhere far ahead. The lotus will open again at dawn on ponds you have already visited in your imagination, in the part of you that knows these places without having been taught them. Sleep now. You are the river. You are the river, and you are moving forward, and the sea is not far, and the night is very warm. So we close the scroll on ancient China. Thank you for resting with us tonight. Until our next journey, Lullaby Atlas. Sleep well.